The president put the price tag on his shoes.
Oh,
And so he had his
I've seen those too.
and he got the shoes on sale.
And that's what I'm telling you, man. All those things kind of matter. When I was in the classroom, I would bring a instructional design. We would talk about there's adult education, right? We talk everything about colors, conducive to education, colors, comfort. What do? Especially in the U.S. government, we buy the lowest bidder, white paint. Is that the best environment for learning? Absolutely not. And the lighting and the arrangement of the classroom.
And the audio even.
And the audio, the tower terror, and then podium, which is like, it's like a barrier. Most week, I protected myself. Like, so we had money. The board, what we wanted was multimedia, so that you can do anything. So, I will tell you, most of the stuff was beyond my capabilities.
Well, they were there.
They were. Got it. I'm almost there. I got one butt cheek hanging off the side. Then. You'll see me. I won't occupy the whole thing. And then you'll sit there. This is it. Hi, everybody. And it's like memories.
I'm like, $18 was just a and that's great.
Calculate, you look at the schedule. Generally, you know, so one day check that's pretty good. Out there, the overseer's road.
Is that picture out there now? Yeah. Oh my goodness.
Can you hear me? All right, there you go. We will soon be joined by an onslaught of amazing FIU top talent. Some of our students that are here for a 3-day Future of Space, Aerospace Innovation Policy fly-in to coincide also with AUSA. I'm Carlos Becerra, and I know folks are tuned in online as well. On behalf of FIU, it's a pleasure to welcome you here today. We know it's a very busy week. Obviously, AUSA seems to be taking a lot of our time for those that are engaged in a lot of those meetings and conference activities. But welcome on behalf of Miami's Public Research University. And it's great to see old friends, new friends, and folks that are also visiting us for the first time. In what we affectionately call Miami's embassy here in the nation's capital, because as you've already tasted some and you got in a taste of or heard a little bit of the sounds of South Florida. But our MO here, and it's very collaborative and it's timely with today's program for the university, is we're here to advance solutions and advocate on behalf of our researchers and our students, but in particular to partner with our very important federal partners, as well as other important organizations within the DC area, here to support our students' success, hence the students you'll be interacting with a little bit later. And as we're proving today, also harness our convening power and focus on some key themes that the university and our researchers are very much focused on, whether it be environmental resilience, chronic disease, defense technologies, that was yesterday's program, technology, etc. Quick fun fact about these amazing walls. Please, you can interact with them before you leave this evening. This will give you a taste of some of the key research initiatives that we're leading here at the university. Today, of course, Latin America and the Caribbean, and a lot of the issues facing the Americas. And I know as a university, many of our centers and institutes are excited to be engaged in this year's Summit of the Americas in December, which is, I think this is also not only a prelude to the Hemispheric Security Conference, but also one for the summit and the work that Dr. Brian Fonseca, everyone, round of applause, will be leading. But I do want to give a special shout out. I see Ambassador Frank Mora, also one of our amazing faculty members. Randy Pastana, where's Randy? There you go. We miss you in the core, of course. Bruce Vittor, Clint Archangel, I think already left, but it's because of our faculty that we're able to bring folks and partners like you in and out of government. And it's another special shout out. I see Jason Marzak, who's going to be moderating a panel here. The important partnership we have with the Atlantic Council, and we've kind of just taken it to another level and formalizing an MOU. And so many of our staff members and alums, and I think we'll be seeing Miguel here a little later, our first FIU Atlantic Council intern there at the Adrian Arsh Latin American and Caribbean Center. So Jason, it's great to have you here, as always. I guess we're going to kick it off now with Dr. Brian Fonseca.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and first and foremost, welcome. Carlos mentioned the convening power, and as he was saying convening power, I was looking around the room, and it's no surprise that so many thought leaders in the Latin American security defense space are here. I mean, just the top tier. When you look at the agenda, and I looked at the people that committed to being here, truly the world-class thought leadership on Latin American security and defense. And of course, as soon as I say thought leader on security and defense, Eric Farnsworth walks through the door in the back. Hey, Eric. No, so grateful to have you all here. Again, we'll be joined by, as Carlos said, an onslaught of students that are up here as part of a fly-in around space and security and defense. And again, it's no surprise we did this on the sidelines of the Association of the U.S. Army annual convening. I and many of you have been, on this, at the event throughout the week so far, and it's just enormously impressive to see how much capability is packed in the U.S. military and the U.S. Army in particular. So it's no surprise also that we are going to start the event by having a retired general join us from the U.S. Army, and then we're going to close the event with a brigadier general who's also going to join us this evening to talk about the future of warfare. And so it's an incredible lineup that we have, and I want to thank, again, you for being here. I want to thank our partners on this, RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, one of the oldest think tank, not one of, the oldest think tank in London. So Dr. Carlos Solar, appreciate you being here. Athena Lab and Juan Pablo Toro, who's joining us, who's the executive director of Athena Lab in Chile. This is something that we wanted to do collaboratively around the world. And so last April, we held our first event in Chile as a part of this. Later, actually in early 2026, we'll partner with RUSI, and so we'll go to London, and we'll continue the conversation around international security and security defense specifically in this hemisphere. So it's just part of our, again, convening authority and bringing thought leadership together to try to promote meaningful discourse on issues around hemispheric security. And so this we also build as a prelude to HSC 2026. And so if you're familiar with our Hemispheric Security Conference, it's a conference that Frank Mora and Randy Pastana and I started, 11 years ago. I was going to say it is 2015, 16, but 11 years ago. So this year we'll hit our 11th annual. And in the lead up to HSC, which is taking place April 27th and 28th in Miami, we're doing a series of events to continue to promote dialogue around security in the hemisphere. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first moderator, who is a stranger to no one at this point, one of the senior thought leaders at Council. I was going to say Council of the Americas, but that's not it either. It's our key partner, the Atlantic Council, who's going to moderate this session with Mr. Juan Cruz and retired Major General Dusty Schultz, a conversation on the security context today. And so with that, Jason, can I invite you up?
Thanks so much, Juan, please. Actually, Dusty, Major General, if you want to sit in the middle here, Juan and I will flank you on either side. Yes. So thanks so much for that introduction. Welcome to this first panel. I'm Jason Marzek, Vice President at the Atlantic Council and Senior Director of our Adrian Arch Latin America Center. I have the privilege of moderating this first conversation. I feel like as a moderator, the role is to provide substance, key takeaways, but also to entertain the audience as well.
Dance?
I sing, but you don't want to hear it. And I can tell jokes, but that's even worse. But we'll try to do, because this is the first, Brian, I think of a number of panels that last until about 7:30 this evening. So I just want to, as Carlos was saying, and Dr. Fonseca, congrats again, Brian, we're saying at the outset, just say how excellent is the partnership that we have at the Atlantic Council with Florida International University. This is a partnership that goes to part of the roots of who we are at the Adrian Arch Latin America Center and the deep ties that our community has to Miami, and so only natural the excellent work that FIU does that we decided to formalize that partnership over this summer, and also we have this leading up to the Hemispheric Security Conference. When I make my travel plans for the year, late April is usually Miami is part of those travel plans, right? So I think for everybody else, right, Brian, April 27th and 28th. So this first panel, we're going to talk about the new national security strategy. And spoiler alert before we begin the panel is the strategy is not out. So we are not going to be talking about the actual strategy. We're going to be talking about some of the threats in the hemisphere and what might be in the strategy. But we're looking at this strategy that will be out, and we'll talk to both Juan Cruz and the Major General as part of this conversation today. But looking at what's going to be contextualized as part of the strategy, what might figure into the strategy, and what does that mean, moving forward as well. And I think this also comes, of course, at a time where there is increased U.S. emphasis on regional stability, increased U.S. importance being placed on the Western Hemisphere from a defense perspective, from a Department of War perspective that we haven't previously seen. We see strategic competition that's playing out alongside U.S. borders. We see increasing influence of adversaries in the Western Hemisphere. That goes everywhere from infrastructure investments to disinformation campaigns to minerals, telecommunications, energy. At the same time, we see the increased reliance and importance of supply chains, secure, prosperous supply chains, resilient supply chains closer to home, as well as the president's focus on migration, illicit networks, drug cartels, and what that means across the Western Hemisphere. Increasingly seeing the importance of the Western Hemisphere as tied very much to domestic priorities, especially from a defense perspective. So Joined with me on stage here to help to give us some of the ideas behind what we might see moving forward is Major General Dusty Schultz. Dusty was former Director of Intelligence at U.S. Southern Command and will speak from your experience from Southcom, but also your experience beyond that as well. I'm also joined by Juan Cruz. Juan is a former National Security Council Senior Director for the Western Hemisphere and Special Assistant to President Trump. And Juan is also a non-resident Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So this is, I think, before I tee this up even further, recognize the fact that the Western Hemisphere, I think we can all say, is no longer a region of peripheral focus. This is a region where the U.S. government is laser focused on from a number of different departments, and including from a national security perspective. And so we're going to take this next 45 minutes, maybe 40 minutes, and look at what are some of the tools, what are some of the things we should be watching out for, and how could this strategy be playing out. And I want to start with you, Major General. So your time at the J2, what are some of help us to paint the broader picture before we get into what the national security strategy might look like or what it could look like and some of the threats. But what are some of the most pressing transnational or regional security threats or trends that you see in the Western Hemisphere that should be elevated to the next national security strategy?
Well, thank you. And it's a great honor to be here today. And I will tell you that this hemisphere is near and dear to my heart. And I am thankful that while I started working a lot in this hemisphere when I was a young major, only to come back as an intelligence director some 10 plus years later was pretty impactful. And in that time, I learned a lot. So when I tell you that in a little bit of a story fashion. So when I came to Southern Command as a major in 2010, most people didn't really think much about Southern Command and applying anything of resources to it. They didn't recognize that it was the breadbasket to the world. They didn't recognize that it had more of the key minerals to the world and the capability to provide the stability for our hemisphere. By the time I came back, some 12 years later, a lot of things had changed. The picture of what was going on in our hemisphere had dramatically changed. We started originally with a picture of, touting where we had come for democracy and how we had so many of our partner nations throughout the hemisphere turning towards democracy in 2010. And when I came back, I was shocked to find out simple things. I had just left being the director of the Army's Space, Cyber, and Data Program as the director of strategic operations. And I was shocked to find out that there were more Chinese space-based ground assets in Latin America than all the other combatant commands combined. I had learned some 10 years prior that dual use was a real thing, that many countries used ports and capabilities for many different reasons. But when I came back 14 years, 10 to 14 years later, we were seeing dual-use facilities being built out throughout the entire Caribbean, particularly from the Chinese, and we were also seeing those dual-use facilities, and you think of things like the Port of Shanghai. You think of a lot of things, and I am a firm believer in every country's ability to govern itself and to celebrate that. But we, as a hemisphere, have done a bit of ignoring the need to invest in the cultures and understanding that the threat that was really undermining for a long time this hemisphere was transnational criminal organizations, which were rotting away at the good order and discipline of nations, which also allowed predatory lending practices to come in. And then you also had things like 35 million Sputnik Mundo users in Spanish and Portuguese. And so the messaging to the people was not even truth.
So I'm going to jump in here, and I think a few key points to pick up from what you're saying. Chinese dual-use facilities, transnational organized TCOs, as well as I think an important additional point you mentioned is the corrupting factor that has then on governments. But Juan, let me go to you. Pick up that same question. When you're looking at some of the most pressing transnational regional security trends in the hemisphere, what are we not talking about? What should we be giving more attention to that's already on the radar screen? And what are some of the things that maybe are that we're missing from time to time?
Perfect. Thank you, Jason. And thanks to Brian and the great team at FIU for having us here, including us in this discussion. I think I'd jump right into it and say that if we're looking to see what the national security strategy is going to say, and what are the most important things that we'll be attacking here? The first thing that I would point to is probably in the Trump administration are going to tell you, just look what's been taking place in the last 9 months, and that gives you an idea what's going to be on the national security strategy. And if we look particularly at the developments, recent developments in the Southern Caribbean and relative to Venezuela, that'll give you a good idea of how we're going to do it. And if I had to spit out what it is that we're going to do, we're not doing enough of, I'm going to go to the whole counter-narcotics and public security realm, because it's been an area that's been largely abandoned. And we talk about the Chinese displaced us. Sometimes it's our fault. There was a gap, and they filled that gap. And in places like the Caribbean, where the Caribbean countries are going to say two things to us. First of all, that as soon as we started fighting the war on terror, that we abandoned the Caribbean. And it's going to be the United States, Canada, the UK, France, and the Dutch. These are the people who usually and traditionally have had an interest in the Caribbean. And we were displaced, and we didn't replace it with anything. And some of our largest programs, especially counter-narcotics ones, we walked away from. And that's allowed and prevented and provided for a perfect environment for this thing to fester and grow. And not just the Caribbean countries, but most countries in the region will tell you, have been telling us for a long time, that the number one thing that they need is assistance combating cartels and narcotics trafficking organizations, helping them with public security, and all the polling in the region tells you this is the number one concern of the population of these areas. And so when you look at, as recently as in the last week, the removal of yet one more Peruvian president, one of the arguments used for that was her abandonment of this charge of protecting the Peruvian people from, organized crime, narcotics trafficking, and the violence that brings to our communities. So if you think of one issue, I'd say counter-narcotics, public security. We haven't done enough. We're doing more, and these countries want more from us. And what does that look like? We need to have enhanced programs in parts of this hemisphere that we still haven't demonstrated an investment in.
And on the Peru example, one of the first things that the new president did the day after was went to a Peruvian jail, took photos with prisoners, similar to what you would see come out of a photo that President Bukele might do in El Salvador, right? And so that really shows, whether it's Peru, whether it's Athena Lab, Juan Pablo, and based in Chile, that security is really dominating the conversation as part of the Chilean elections as well. But we see that kind of festering, and that's partly a lack of attention that governments have given, and also the fact is, as we're saying here, that there's been a lack of attention that the U.S. has historically placed from a comprehensive perspective outside of the kind of assistance programs. I want to go back to you, Major General. When you look at these threats, and we've talked counter-narcotics, security, Chinese dual use, TCOs, corruption. How should we be thinking about prioritizing those concerns with regard to broader global security concerns?
So I'm personally biased, and I think we need to prioritize this at the top of our concerns, because our secure hemisphere is what's going to make us stronger. And ignoring it and saying that we need to work on something of an Indo-PACOM nature, a European nature, we need to get after our own hemisphere now and the cooperation with our partners throughout this hemisphere to make it strong, capable, and to eliminate that risk that Juan was expressing.
And Juan, going back to you were mentioning the counter-narcotic security, but also China has historically played a big concern, and in the U.S. lens, Russia to an extent as well. We've spoken about the degree to which Russian threats in the hemisphere, how profound are they, and what do they actually look like in reality? But how should the U.S. how should we be thinking about China, Russia, and the hemisphere? We could throw potentially even Iran into the equation as well. How should we be thinking about that presence without simply framing the region through this lens of great power rivalry? Because, you and the Major General, myself, anytime we talk to any leader across the hemisphere, no one wants to be in the middle of a great power rivalry. So how should we be thinking about this increased presence, which varies based on the country, the extra regional country, as well as the regional country? How should we be thinking about that and thinking about what that means insofar as the well-being of the country itself, rather than what it means specifically through the U.S. lens?
Sure, Jason. The Chinese haven't just outmaneuvered us in the region, but they have in certain sense displaced us. But they've also been very successful in their presence in a sort of more subtle way. And so if we can pick almost any topic, things for us to worry about. I'm old enough so that I remember when in Latin America, countries were disturbed by the fact that foreign powers own their infrastructure, railroads, telephone, telegraph, those sorts of things, power and energy. And a lot of countries in our region, of course, protested. There were revolutions about this and nationalizations and so on and so forth. So I try to ask myself, then why would it be that China owns and has purchased so many public utility companies and so forth in Brazil, Sao Paulo and Rio? Everyone knows, not great investments. Why are they gobbling them up? Or in Peru, for that matter, all flying under the radar and things that we've permitted to take place. Or let's take a slice out of our military posture and interest. Again, I'm old enough to remember when our military assistance programs were rich as both in terms of money and in ideas and energy, and able to, in promoting the whole idea of bringing foreign military and security services to this country to be exposed to how our beliefs and how we did things, and in collaboration and that sort of thing. And I'm not suggesting we don't do that, but I would say we don't even do it 1/5 of the level we did before. You know who does that?
And China does that now.
The Chinese do that, and they do it very well, and they do it all the time. And if you're a security service, a military in our region, and you want to set yourself apart to get promoted to colonel and general, you have to show all sorts of exposure and special. And if you have a course in national security from China, that puts you over the top, and you're indebted to the Chinese. So I'm just picking some examples here and there. We could spend the entire day just talking about the subject, and I'll just say one thing on the Russians. Totally different than the Chinese, and focus more on what I would call information operations and their very, very successful infiltration of Russia Today, rebranded RT, so that you don't see the Russia part, in the region. That's for free, and most of the time when you have a DirecTV or you get your basic cable system. Whereas in these countries you have to pay for CNN, and for others, all of a sudden your main source of news on cable networks in your language is Russian.
I think even as we do some of our information monitoring through AC Tech programs, we've also seen that CNN, look at RT and Espanol, the website, right, that gets significantly more page views than CNN Espanol does. So it's through the TV operators, it's also through kind of online searching as well, that the Russians, low cost, high reward, right? But I think it's an important point you made, Juan, about the fact that you can't put Russia and China in the same basket, right? There's two different motives, there's different tactics, and that really figures into the national security strategy. Dustin, I want to get any comments on what Juan said, but then I want to shift the conversation, but give you an opportunity to make any comments first.
He's spot on, and so really understanding that and that impact is huge, because you're talking scope and scale and generational. And that's impactful, and that's something that we have to talk about, think about, and invest in.
So I want to move more to the exact point of this conversation, which is actually look at the new national security strategy. This is helpful for framing that strategy. And again, the strategy is not out. I guess reporting is maybe in the next few weeks it'll be out. But what I want to do is actually look back at previous national security strategies. So how is the strategic importance of Latin America and the Caribbean evolved in recent national security strategies? Not that that portends what's going to be in this strategy, but if you could just walk us through a little bit of how the region's kind of role has evolved, and I'll start with you, Dusty.
So the role has evolved. I mean, I think often years back it was just ignored. I mean, it wasn't bubbling enough. It wasn't in your face enough to be of an urgent need to be responsive and to be supportive. As time has moved on, we've given it some head nods of this is an important region and we need to get after it. But still, in my opinion, the strategies have not been clear enough to make sure that strengthening our hemisphere should be our number one priority. It just hasn't. And people have not recognized the vulnerability that we've placed resources from throughout this region and the partnerships as we move forward.
Juan, your thoughts? Take us through a little bit through the evolution of national security strategies.
Certainly, I think what we'll see is we saw in the last national security strategy as it dealt with the region, it was full of citations on China, and it should have. And we're not going to forget about the Chinese target, despite some rumors and suggestions that the new national security strategy will give a greater emphasis on the hemisphere versus outside actors. I think that's actually the best of both worlds. My sense is that what we're going to do is we're going to return to a better balance of issues. We can, the U.S. and our military in particular, we can absolutely do two things at once, which is to focus on these issues in the region and the external actors. I think breathing new life into the security posture and assisting these countries in the counter-narcotics realm and the combat against cartels is absolutely doable, and the investment there, while at the same time combating these external actors. It's just adding to our charge, and as we've got resources available left over from the war on terror and methodologies, techniques, practices, and procedures that we can apply to these to the threat in the region, I think we're absolutely well positioned to do that. And if you have any questions, I'd say if you look at the national security strategy in the 4 years of the first Trump administration, you'll see that there were other issues other than China, but not enough emphasis on these issues. Maybe lastly, what I would point out is go back to, it's very easy. What's going to be there? America first. It's going to be, critical minerals, China, of course, anything having to do with our migration policy and counter-narcotics.
What do you? I'm going to follow up question for you, and then I'm going to go back to you, Dusty. But what is success given the nature in which we expect the strategy to evolve this year? What does success potentially look like insofar as bringing these issues that are, as we're saying, they're paramount not just for U.S. concerns, not just for the president, but also for citizens around the hemisphere, combating TCOs, illicit networks, corruption, et cetera. So, what could success look like if some of these factors are more incorporated, but further incorporated into this upcoming strategies?
Well, traditionally they've been defined in the region as stability and democracy, right? Because it's precisely between the violence, the corruption, and the erosion in society caused by the cartels. That's precisely the area that we've been involved in rather successfully over time. And now what we've seen is a resurgence of these in a different kind of image, but a resurgence. And we know how to deal with this problem. We just need to, apply the right resources and attention.
I will also make a note for everybody in the audience. If you came in late, there's some amazing food over there, and there's some great coffee as well. That's why one of the reasons I always come over to the FIU office is for the coffee here. But Major, let me go back to you. How do you, so if, as we're saying, that extra regional actors will be part of the strategy and should be part of the strategy, but the strategy will have a increased focus and should have an increased focus on organized crime, illicit networks, other issues that are paramount to the hemisphere's concerns itself. How do you think this will impact how we counter some of the adversarial influence in the region of extra regional actors who have traditionally played maybe a little bit more of a role and a mindset in how we think about the security concerns closer to home?
Well, I'm really excited that we're really getting closer to a whole of government response and really looking at how we dive in after that problem set of those transnational criminal organizations. Most people don't realize the multiple billion-dollar industry, $300 billion industry that the transnational criminal organizations, and people thinks it's all drugs, and it's not. It's illegal fishing.
There's over 20 different different illicit markets.
And so you've got these markets. And so how do we get after it with a strategy that ties in the whole of government and that capability and really digs hard to make sure that we're focused on that, and not only focused on it as the United States, but how we're dealing with our partners and that security cooperation.
Jason, could I add just one point to that,
please.
to what the general said, is that this is also, these organizations have mutated to polycrime. So what happens is it's not just about narcotics trafficking. They're into anything where you can make money, and they have franchises, and they get to, rent out their names and their guns. And so it's going to be a lot tougher in that regard, right? Because you have to fight everything: illegal logging and mining and extortion and kidnapping and the trafficking of flora and fauna, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And I think illegal gold in particular is a profound problem, because illegal gold converts to being legal once it enters international markets. Illicit drugs are always going to be illicit, but gold is. And I think the question then becomes, how can the national security strategy, and how can we be getting one step ahead of the transnational criminal organizations, because they're really good at, you close off one market and they open up the next market, because these are businesses. They're business that are just trying to make money. They're monopolies that try to keep out the competition. So how could this national security, especially with this greater emphasis on illicit networks, organized crime, how can we be getting maybe two steps ahead of because I think to this point, organized crime has been two steps ahead of government, right?
Right. Because they, government operates at the pace of government. Our bureaucracies are slow. So while we might be effective in, turning off one methodology, maritime-based, all of a sudden it's very easy for them to switch to some other system. For us, we have to have meetings, we have to have approvals.
Maybe a nice panel at FIU.
FIU, and then, I would also add, though, that I'm really interested in knowing what this designation of a new joint task force at Southcom to handle these issues, and how that's going to work with in conjunction with Jihad of South, which brings a whole kind of kaleidoscope of partners and has proven to be very effective. And how do you fold that in, what role they're going to have, and the rules of the road and responsibilities. It'll be very interesting. Maybe that is some of the response to your question.
Major General, I'd like to get your thoughts on what that could
Well,
look
I'm in absolute agreement with you. I also think it's intriguing, as we bring in our foreign partners, how we work through our authorities. One of the biggest challenges, and I've got to give accolades to FIU for the Security Research Hub, because that has enabled the sharing and the transparency of real-time data and information. And so we have something at Southern Command called Enhanced Domain Awareness, which is a form of the Security Research Hub. And most people are not fully aware that for Haiti, we used that, a form of that, with our partners, our international partners. It is so hard for us to share that information, that figuring out a healthy, correct way to share it at speed and transparency and enable based on this task force can be really powerful. But we've got to have the right people in the right place with the ability and agility of the right policies supporting them.
And I think also, one of the big challenges, and from your previous role as Director of Intelligence at Southcom, is intelligence sharing across governments, right? I mean, there's an apprehension, not only across governments, but even within governments to share intelligence. And so how do you think about that? What could be, how could maybe even kind of, as we're looking at kind of new mechanisms of U.S. Cooperation, new U.S. focus on organized crime in the hemisphere, what can we be doing to be able to incentivize that cooperation if we can, right? Because it fundamentally comes to a lack of trust within governments, between governments, but that intelligence sharing is fundamental.
Intelligence sharing, information sharing, intelligence is refined information. Absolutely, it's critical. We say that intelligence should drive operations, and so often we don't share anything, so just operations just run. That's bad business, that's bad military, that's bad strategy. We need to absolutely open it up as appropriate with vetted individuals, but we can't make it so hard, and we've got to also at certain organizations like the GIADF or a task force have the right vetted people that can move at the speed of trust and have the authority and responsibility to do that. That's critical.
So we have about 10 minutes, and I promise you I do actually have probably 20 minutes worth of questions, but I won't do that to our host. But I want to make sure that we do. I think we're probably taking questions from the audience. So we have a fantastic audience here. If there's any questions for the panel, I want to make sure to bring those in. And if you could just introduce yourself with name and affiliation, I'll just give you my mic here. I don't see a mic runner. So there you go.
Hi, I am Gaitaina Florestal, representing FIU with the FIU DC fly-in. My question is, can you dive a little bit more into your discussion with Haiti and also with exchanging intelligence and kind of discussing what the main issue is and how can we fix that with transparency?
Thank you. And as just in the interest of time, there's another question. I could take two questions at the same time, maybe even three. Is there a second question? No? Yeah, I can. I see Eric Farnsworth back in the last row. He'll be speaking on the next panel, though, so you could ask him all your questions then. Okay, so let's take that Haiti question.
So in reference to Haiti, so we have, it's hard, and honestly, it's hard enough with our rules and regulations within the United States government to share within government organizations. It's hard from the intelligence community from which I come for me to share outside of the intelligence community because they want to protect it. I have a firm belief that we need to protect exquisite intelligence, top secret things, but when you have unclassified things, how do you share that? And so sharing it with cross-governmental in Kenya, how do you share it with, Colombia? How do you share it with Nicaragua, El Salvador, and everybody being cautious? Now, additionally, in Haiti, you have a need of, the forces that are coming in, and that they're also working with the people on the ground where there is also a lack of trust within the military police force-ish. I'm not sure what you really want to call them, but the last remaining governmental capability within Haiti. So as you have all these capabilities, how do you do that? So what we did is we created an unclassified data source where we were able to pull in data sources from different commercial imagery and the like, so it could be used to see blockades on streets and different things. But then who do you share that with? Because you don't want it to get in the hands of the drug lords and the gangs which are running the nation at this time. And so that became a problem set, and going back and fixing the mindset of people of what you're sharing, why you're sharing, and that you can. Because honestly, at the baseline user level, we have trained much of our intelligence and operational community that you can't share. And instead of giving the ethical parameters on how to share. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So and, can I toss a question in, Jason?
Yeah, please. Dr. Fonseca.
Maybe this is a little provocative, but I appreciate the thoughtfulness so far, and I think I agree with just about everything you said about the orientation of American foreign policy and national security strategy. There's a lot of speculation, though, that maybe the national defense strategy sort of preempts and comes out before the national security strategy, which isn't, of course, the way things are supposed to flow. Any thoughts on how? And again, I know we're not there yet. Nothing's been released, and for all we know, there's a national security strategy. It's going to drive a national defense strategy. It's going to drive a national military strategy, et cetera. But where do you think the strategy is going to maybe break sort of the mold of what we've seen historically, with national security strategies in terms of how they're outward facing. Is there any speculation that maybe the national security strategy includes a domestic component in a more rigorous way, given that so much in the headlines? Any thoughtfulness around how maybe the strategy or the thinking might break the mold of how we have contextualized national security thinking?
I think one thing that's breaking the mold as well is how early this strategy is coming out in the administration. So it's coming out, the next few weeks is the reporting, which is very early for an administration. But I think also to Brian's question, what else could be breaking the mold? And I think could domestic security also be part of that national security strategy? And what would that look like?
One question I have is the other strategies, like the national drug strategy. When does that come out? And as you know, we have a paucity of officials in ONDCP and in those roles. And will they matter less, or do they matter at all in a new strategy? And what role do they play? The last drug czar focused an enormous amount of energy on domestic issues, and maybe that was his charge. But there's a question: what role do they play? And then ultimately, that's going to give some of the instruction to those law enforcement agencies and others who will be taking some of their lead from a drug strategy. Other than that, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, it's going to be interesting, because I hope that this indicates that, as often can happen in our government, is everybody steps up to the table and sees what they could contribute to the mission. And often there is an eagerness to show that you have relevance, and if that's what it takes in the region, the agencies tend to be able to readjust so that they absolutely do reflect national security strategy, stated or not.
And maybe a thought, maybe to you, Major General, or to Juan as well. I mean, I think going back to Brian's question, your response as well is the fact that this president has placed security as front and center for his agenda, whether it's agenda domestically or agenda in the Americas. So in some ways, it's not a surprise that the strategy is coming out so early, and then and it's also, you see the meeting that the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, convened just recently. So really the importance of security for the administration shows, I think, is emblematic of the importance of this security strategy specifically. And so maybe my last question is then—
Can I jump in real quick?
Please.
Okay, because I think you also need to stay and pay attention to the fact that there has been a direction to merge Army North and Army South and Forces Command. And so that puts a combined, unified perspective from ground forces, from the military perspective, on this hemisphere. That in itself is a powerful thing that, in my opinion, will also be a derivative of that strategy, capability, and moving forward.
And I'm going to add to that is, I think they're going to be prepared to use all the tools available in the toolbox, which wasn't the fact before. For the decades that we've been fighting the war on drugs, that wasn't the case.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to your point originally, Juan, as we look at what's going to be in that strategy. Well, we can look at some of the operations that have been conducted in the hemisphere thus far in the administration. That gives some clues. My last just quick question to both of you is, what needs to be in the strategy, and how should we be thinking about it so that the goals of that strategy stick beyond one administration, right? And how should we be, kind of thinking about what might come out of the strategy so that, optimally, some of the focus on a secure Western Hemisphere. I think that one of the things that this panel has said is that it's important that our strategy is likely going to be evolving from one that's been traditionally more focused on extra regional actors to balancing that with the security concerns emanating from the hemisphere itself, organized crime, illicit trafficking, et cetera. But what are you seeing that could be in that strategy? Because I think the president as well wants his legacy to be beyond just one administration. So what does that look like insofar as how does that play out then as part of the strategy?
To me, that means Congress. And the times that we have been successful in our counter-drug endeavors in the hemisphere, we've had strong partners in Congress, and Congress has, rightly so, taken credit for good things and tried to help the agencies when they had challenges, and of course resource the whole thing. And in the past, I've seen a lack of fire in the belly on the issue in Congress, and I hope that the president's moves restores that.
Structure, resourcing, support is absolutely critical, because if we're going to get this whole of government response that is dedicated to ensuring the strength of this hemisphere, it's critical.
Well, with that, I know I always like to end on time. It's precisely 5 o'clock, and I know we have a next panel that's lined up here. There might be more questions in the audience, so please feel free to speak with the panelists afterwards over some great FIU coffee, and I see other snacks out there as well. But please join me in a round of applause for the Major General for Juan Cruz. Thank you. Brian, back over to you.
Right, excellent commentary, very thoughtful remarks, so I really appreciate that, sort of setting the stage and kicking us off. It's now my pleasure to invite our next moderator to the stage, Juan Pablo Toro, who's the Executive Director of Athena Lab in Chile. And of course, I'd like to invite our speakers up, and then JP will do a proper introduction of our speakers. So Margaret, Laura, Brian, where did Brian go? There we go. All right. And then Eric should be back. He went to the restroom. Yeah, he just stepped out. He was intimidated, so he ran. He'll be up here in a moment.
Thank you, Brian. Well, hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank to my friends at the FIU's Jack Gordon Institute, Brian, Bruce, and everyone involved for organizing this conference. In doing so, we are continuing the dialogue we began this year in Santiago de Chile. Eric. Welcome. Yeah. The dialogue we began this year in Santiago de Chile to contribute to the establishment of a positive working agenda between the United States and Latin America, an agenda that will help ensure a secure, prosperous, and free Western Hemisphere. Now I have the honor of moderating the panel titled, Is the U.S. Returning to Strategic Denial in the Western Hemisphere?, where distinguished specialists in the region will be responsible for answering this complex question. Before moving to the question, I will briefly introduce our guest. First, we got here Laura Delgado Lopez. Is a senior fellow at FIU's Jack Gordon Institute for Public Policy, where she provides subject matter expertise in space activities and governance, with a focus on Latin America and emerging space ecosystems. She draws on over 15 years working in space policy in the Washington, D.C. area, in a career spanning industry, the non-profit sector, and government. Then we got Eric Farnsworth. He's a senior associate with the Americas program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. He's a senior executive and professional with a lot of experience in the White House, State Department, and USTR, and longtime widely recognized leader in the foreign policy and trade communities in Washington. Then we got Margaret Myers. Is a director of the Asia and Latin American program at the Inter-American Dialogue and senior fellow at the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy. And last but not least, we got here Brian Winter. He's an editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly, that I strongly recommend, and a well-respected analyst of Latin American politics. So I suggest we start with the broader picture and then move to the more specific topics. So let's begin with Margaret, if you're okay, Margaret. Let's kick the things off by answering the question that names our panel. Is the U.S. returning to strategic denial in the Western Hemisphere? Do you think this will be the main approach of Trump administration to curb the Chinese influence in the region, and where should they start?
You know, I'd be very interested. I hope this will be a point of debate, you know, throughout the entirety of the panel and among those who are in the audience and might be interested in, you know, sharing their own perspectives. But it's been my sense that some degree of strategic denial, right, has been part of the the strategy, not just during this administration, but certainly during Trump 1, even in the Obama era, right? We saw some elements of this, and also during the Biden administration. Real concern about specific projects, right, and their implications for U.S. national security. There were also concerns about the effects of certain projects, right, on governance, on the environment, on social outcomes, right, in certain parts of the region. And so it's a little bit of, I mean, yes, this is happening. The question is whether it's increasing, right, and then what the implications of that are. My sense is that at this juncture, right, the U.S. has come to the conclusion, or at least many in the U.S. have come to the conclusion, I think within this administration there's a certain, this resonates as well, right, that China's inroads, China's footprint in the region is so extensive, right? It's so massive and it extends across so many domains that it makes it impossible to achieve, you know, a full-scale denial, right? This is not in any possible, realm of possibility. It's also the case, as we've seen in recent polling, that many in the region view China increasingly as a reliable partner, right? And in many cases, it takes two to tango, right? You need some degree of agreement on the part of partner nations about whether or not they'll take certain courses of action as concerns specific projects of interest to the United States, right? And so all of this limits, you know, the possibilities for doing something more comprehensive and for really making, I think, the sort of inroads, the sort of progress that this administration and others may have wanted to make in terms of achieving strategic denial. And so what we're seeing instead, right, and this is not new. Again, this has been, you know, many years in the works, is an effort to really focus on very specific projects, right, that the U.S., again, deems as critical from a primarily national security perspective. And here I'm talking ports, right? I'm talking any sort of surveillance-related infrastructure, certainly space infrastructure, right? These are the things that have been of focus. Undersea cables, right? We talked about this in the last panel, all of these things. And then, of course, some elements of finance have you know, resonated in the U.S. discourse as concerns China, Latin America for a number of years now, be they big loans from the policy banks, right, or these credit swaps that we see in the case of Argentina and Brazil, for instance. And so those are the things, right, and it's almost by default that the U.S. has focused on really just trying to move the needle on those, right, to dissuade governments from moving forward with these projects or to dismantle those entirely. And, you know, Argentina, sometimes they do this with, you know, by encouraging by offering, you know, some form of assistance. Costa Rica is an example of that, and potentially Argentina as well, if we see these deals coming through, right? But in other cases, it's just been a very strong conversation, right, with those in charge, suggesting that this is not the course of action and there may be repercussions if it is pursued. My concern, and I wrote about this in America's Quarterly piece that came out today, my big concern, and I've been very worried about this for a long time, preceding, you know, for years preceding this administration, right? That this sort of piecemeal reaction, this piecemeal and reactive approach to really trying to derail or affect the outcomes of specific projects, you know, this one, that thing's a problem, will not meaningfully alter the trajectory of China-Latin America relations, right? It also ignores the fact that these relations are co-produced, right? It's not just China going to the region and doing things. It's Latin America asking for them. And so we have to consider that this is a two-way thing, right? And that is often lost, I think, in discussions here in Washington and elsewhere. It's also going to be based largely on an ever-shifting China policy. And my other concern is that so much of how we conceptualize what China is doing, what China's interests are, where it's heading, is based on a 2015 understanding of the China-Latin America dynamic, of one in which the BRI was ascendant. We were seeing tons of capital, especially in terms of finance, right, entering the region, many billions to certain countries, large-scale infrastructure. Chiang Kai was a legacy of that, right? It's not a now project. It's having implications now, obviously, but that was developed then. And so we are at a dramatically different moment in this relationship. It's one that is driven by China's own policy. It's one that's driven by Latin American demand. And it's one that is going to be even more difficult, I think, for the U.S. to compete with and in. And so our selective approach, I mean, it simply isn't going to hit the mark, right? It's not going to dramatically alter the trajectory of this dynamic. And so what is needed, right, is a clear-eyed view, a clear-eyed assessment of China's interests, how they are changing or not. Are they static? Are they changing, right? The limits of U.S. and Chinese competitiveness in the region, we need to understand and really evaluate those, measure them against each other, to take into consideration the role of the region in this process, what they want, whether this very commonly, it would be worth really asking, I think, in this session too, whether this one phrase that I hear articulated, I don't know how many times in Washington, is an accurate one, that Latin America would prefer to work with us if we were there. And I think in many cases they would, right? If only we would step up and do the things. But is that becoming not true in certain parts of the region? And do we need to come to terms with that? And then, this came up, Jason made this really critical point in the previous session too, but what is it to counter China? What's the end goal here? What does winning look like? And how, do we achieve that? And so just a bit more, and I think a better hemispheric-wide strategy is in order, and certainly that's not an easy thing to achieve, but something that I'll just provocatively put out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. Brian, given Latin America... given Latin America's more diverse and complex global relationships, do you think this policy of strategic denial can truly work today? We have the case of Brazil, the region's giant, but where is Brazil's alignment today with the BRICS or the so-called Global South?
First of all, I'd like to thank Brian Fonseca and FIU for the invitation today. FIU is a valued member of the Council of the Americas as well as a partner of America's Quarterly. So it's great to be here. I'm happy to share a stage again with my friend Eric Farnsworth, our cover story author out today, Margaret, and Laura, good to see you. Future author? And a future author, I hope. That would be great. I think that the dynamic of China and Latin America is changing before our very eyes right now. Just to build on some of the things that Margaret said, we've had, over the last 7 years, we've had two right-of-center presidents come into office explicitly vowing to shun China. And within less than a year, both of them dramatically changed their tune. And of course, I'm talking about Jair Bolsonaro when he took office in 2019, and more recently, Javier Milei. Both of them used incredibly strong language during their campaigns about how they were not going to work with China. Milei most recently said that he would not work with communist murderers. And then a month ago, in an interview with the editor-in-chief of The Economist, called them fantastic partners. He said they don't ask for anything. And I think this reflects, the reality that a lot of these presidents face, even when they're ideologically predisposed, when they come into office, and they are in the Brazil story, the story of what happened in the Bolsonaro years, I know better, surprise, surprise, but he was essentially besieged by Brazilian agribusiness interests, prevailing upon him not to alienate their relationship with Brazil's biggest trading partner. And I know that a similar dynamic has been taking place under Milei, and that's why he changed his tune. You talked about a 2015 understanding of this issue. I think that's a great phrase. I think as recently as 10 years ago, I do think that there was a view held by leaders across Latin America that they could strike a balance between Washington and Beijing. And as a result, during the last cycle of right-of-center leaders, they kind of were able to do that. I mean, Mauricio Macri, Sebastián Piñera during his second term, Iván Duque, these were all leaders who had a good relationship with the Trump administration and a very good relationship with Beijing. All three of these leaders, if I'm not mistaken, all three of them made state visits to Beijing and were some of the most enthusiastic proponents that we saw of greater engagement, whether it was investment or kind of geopolitical ties with China. I wonder if that's going to be as true going forward. And, you know, I see the Trump administration, and there was a lot of talk in the prior panel about what their new strategy will look like. One senses more determination this time around to try to drive that wedge. And, you know, we'll see what the fine print of that looks like. Margaret, you referenced, I'll say this, I think the same point in a different way. These are sovereign countries that are going to have to make their own decisions about who they partner with. And sometimes efforts to try to get them to break away from Beijing can spectacularly backfire. The sanctions that the Trump administration put on Brazil back in July, they were not explicitly, they did not, as I recall, mention China. It was not one of the top reasons. The president spoke both to the press and in his, they're not tweets anymore, they're truths, in his truths. Close enough. He spoke about, you know, the Bolsonaro family and the quote-unquote witch hunt facing them. But, you know, I think all of us heard, both extra officially and in the press, that they were trying to get Brazil to, you know, to align less with Beijing, or that was one of their goals over time. They thought they were creating leverage to do so. And it's very clear that the Lula administration has moved more toward Beijing as well as toward diversifying its relationships with other Asian countries in the months since that's happened. Just one final thought. I mean, further proof perhaps that it's going to be harder for countries to strike that balance going forward. We have not yet seen the fine print of the deal between the Trump administration and Argentina. There has been plenty of speculation, including some recently, even in the last 48 hours, that one of the requirements of the financing will be breaking the lease or otherwise, asking doesn't quite seem the right word, but inducing the Argentines to break the Chinese base that's in the south of the country. And I also know that the Trump administration was upset earlier this year when Milei decided to renew the currency swap that Buenos Aires had with the Chinese. One assumes that now that the U.S. Treasury has gotten into the currency swap business, that the expectation will be that Argentina will not do that anymore with China. So these are specific examples that point us to, you know, perhaps a more energized intent by the Trump administration to move countries away from China. But I suspect that we will see as many successful cases of that as cases where those kinds of actions will backfire and have the opposite effect. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Eric, how could a policy of strategic denial help prevent the influence of revisionist powers in the Western Hemisphere, which provide diplomatic, economic, and military support to criminal dictatorships like Venezuela?
Thanks for saving the easy one for me, Juan Pablo. I really appreciate that. But it's great to be with you. It's great to be with Brian. Congratulations again, Doctor. That's fantastic. And working with FIU, Athena Lab, the work that you and Nicolas are doing, I think is really, really important. Someday I hope you can be on a panel and talk about the Chilean elections upcoming and tell us what's going to happen. That would be fantastic. It's hard to follow my two colleagues in terms of their comments. They've set the table, I think, very well. And so let me just say a couple things. First of all, I think the Chinese engagement in the Western Hemisphere is a reality. It's been a reality. It's going to be a reality. It is changing. I think all of that is accurate. I think that the Trump administration is focused on this as an issue in the Western Hemisphere. Is it the overriding issue? I don't know. It's a competing priority for sure. And it clearly is impacting the relations that the administration has with individual nations, particularly, as Brian was just, I think, absolutely right in, raising the issue of the bilateral discussions with Argentina. I would also throw into that mix the pending trade negotiations with Mexico and Canada. There's already a China clause in the USMCA. That's going to be bolstered. And to the extent that additional trade agreements, such as the bilateral with Colombia that Mr. Petro has called for renegotiation, foolishly in my view, but to the extent that that is done, I think you can assume that, at least from the U.S. perspective, there will be an insistence to introduce the China issue into further trade negotiations in the Western Hemisphere. I think that's absolutely right. And that's a powerful and potent incentive, or leverage is a better word, that the U.S. has in terms of introducing or expanding this issue in terms of the dialogue of the Western Hemisphere. So I think that's point number one. Point number two is, yes, I agree that China has in some way provided some things that Latin America has wanted, markets certainly, and particularly to the extent that the United States has put up tariff barriers ourselves against Western Hemisphere nations, particularly in agriculture products that, frankly, you know, they don't last forever. They have to be sold. There are enhanced relations between China and the Western Hemisphere on that front, tariffs against China. You know, the whole trade relationship is changing, not just because of U.S. tariffs, but because China, for example, has to find markets if they can't send it into the United States, and Latin America vice versa. So this is a reality that's happening. So there is mutual benefit there, but is there mutual love? And I think that's the question we have to ask. Do the regions, does Latin America love building the relationship with China? And I would argue that the more that China's in the region, the more that question becomes a challenge. You're seeing countries now that have shifted their relationship from Taiwan to China, perhaps regretting that decision. You're seeing country after country recognizing that the promises that China made to them in terms of financing, in terms of all kinds of wonderful, happy things that would happen, have not occurred, that some of the things that have occurred have been shoddy, have been in terms of manufactured products, and they're also beginning to wonder, is it really good for us, Latin America country X, strategically for China, for example, to own our infrastructure, to own the power grid in our country, to build the major port facility that, by the way, in order for Shanghai to actually pay off, it's not just a Peru-China thing, it's a South America-China thing. And so you have to drain the products of South America to Peru. That means intensive infrastructure coming from Brazil. It means tearing apart the very sensitive environmentally Amazon. So there's some real costs here to building that relationship. And I think the more that that is recognized by Latin American and Caribbean publics, the more there is some skepticism about, well, wait a minute, what are we actually doing here? What are we actually getting from China, right? To the extent that the United States is able to present a policy agenda that is attractive to the region, whether it's investment, whether it's in trade, whether it's in people-to-people, whatever it is, that calculus becomes even more complicated for the populations of the Western Hemisphere. It's not to say that there will be a breaking of relations with China. I'm not suggesting that. There will be relations, and there should be relations. I mean, trade needs to happen, right? South America needs markets for its products. But the type of investment that China makes versus the type of investment that Europe or Canada or the United States or Japan would make is different. The externalities are different. The impact on democracy and rule of law in the host country is different. And patterns of trade are also different in the context of things like it's just easier to trade north-south in the same hemisphere with people who share the same language and culture and business practices than it is to trade across the world, separate language, 12 or 13-hour time difference, radically different business practices. So if there's no alternative, I've said this many times, if there's no alternative, there's no alternative, right? If the United States isn't there, if Europe is somewhere else, sure, that relationship is going to build between the Western Hemisphere and China, and it has built. The question is, can it be recaptured in some way so that the natural inclination of the Western Hemisphere as a region that is more attracted to North America and frankly Europe continues to develop in a positive way? I think it's an open question. But I think the default position, Brazil may be separate because it has its own global ambitions, but the default position, I would argue, of most of the Western Hemisphere is to build that relationship with North America and build it with Europe. And the China issue is there, and it's been attractive in some way, particularly for some elites, but it's not the love. It's not a natural connection. And to the extent there is a more effective, more attractive alternative, you're going to see that scale begin to rebalance.
Thank you, Eric. Laura, this discussion has so far focused on broader strategic dynamics, but let's consider it in terms of technology, a critical domain in which many of these dynamics plays out. Given your expertise in space issues, what does a strategic denial look like in the space field and in the technology field more broadly? What is important in the Western Hemisphere, and what could the U.S. offer in this regard? I remember we had a good conversation last May in the conference organized by the FIU about some project in Chile and some observatory blocked by my government recently.
Gracias, Juan Pablo, and thank you so much to FIU. I'm just honored to be part of this panel. So it's great to be last because I can pick up on a few points. What strategic denial in space and in advanced technology, as you asked me, looks like is complicated by the dynamics that the previous speakers described, but also by the changes in space themselves. So whereas in the Cold War, it was easy enough to limit access to the hardware and the technology, that's just not what space is today, right? We need to think of space as a system. And so it includes not just the hardware, the physical technology that is a lot harder to block given it's available everywhere, but also the human piece of actually making sense of it, utilizing it, the infrastructure more broadly, right? There's the ground systems that a couple of you have mentioned, but also the data. And that's where cybersecurity comes in. That's where there's just increasing vulnerabilities as we think about how diverse space activity has become. So it's not just the domain of states anymore. There's also private companies of all sizes, university students launching their first satellites and all that. So we see that level of activity in the region, and that creates opportunities in terms of the engagement of these adversaries, but also challenges in how the US deals with it because it's so piecemeal, because it's so fragmented. And so even in my domain and in technology more broadly, I see that. I see, for example, NASA having excellent engagement, but it's very focused, very targeted, and it's not coordinated with, say, what the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency is doing, what the Space Force is doing. And so it's not a concerted strategy for sure in space. And it's actually, I think, very limited in its effect as a result of that, because preventing the establishment of a ground station doesn't actually achieve that strategic denial. Because at the end of the day, space is about that utilization. That is the interest that these countries have in terms of their space investment. And I think there's also, and I think the previous speakers touched on this too, there's also a limited narrative of where the US is actually engaging very positively. And so, yes, China has the China CELAC space meetings. Space has become an important issue in the BRICS forum. That's something that Brazil has championed, for example. But at the same time, 10 countries in the region are members of the Artemis Accord, a US-led effort to promote global, but really US values in what space exploration looks like. And in terms of sharing of space situational awareness data and exercises and trainings that we do on the military front, that's happening as well. But there's no story, right, telling that. And so I think in the space field, it's more complex, but it's unfortunately the same, just the piecemeal nature of it makes it almost look like we're not present. I think the benefit of it being so complicated is that there are areas where we can really grow. And as I think Eric was just pointing out, it's really about shaping that access. If preventing access to the technology alone isn't going to cut it, but it's about setting the norms. What are the principles? What are the rules of the road? And I think there is interest in that. I will tell you, for example, countries in the region are really interested in fostering commercial space in their countries and participating in the global space market. Well, no one does that as good as the United States does. And that is a model that we can take and that we can create opportunities for, U.S. business and for the development of these ecosystems. But it will, again, take more of an integrated kind of effort, right? And so I would like to see more of a coordinated strategy that thinks about diplomacy, technology, and the civil defense kind of commercial nexus a little bit more. And the last point I'll say, even though we focus so much on China, which is, of course, the primary concern, I will mention just another example of how strategic denial in the traditional sense hasn't worked. Earlier this summer, a ground station for the GLONASS Russian PNT system was just commissioned in Venezuela. It was announced a couple of years ago, but it's now operational. Now that means that Venezuela, but also ostensibly other countries, could rely on the Russian the GPS equivalent for their PNT needs. And so, again, maybe the focus should not just be on blocking infrastructure developments like that, but it is an example if you are focused on the footprint of these adversaries in the Western Hemisphere. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I don't want to monopolize the conversation, so the floor is open to the audience to ask some questions. Anyone? Please identify yourself and your affiliation.
And I am an FIU student for the Fly-In seminar. I'm a hospitality and tourism management major. So I have a question circling back to when we were talking about China and Venezuela, especially right now with how the U.S.'s attitude towards Venezuela and the naval fleets and everything. How would that kind of impact Venezuela's relationship with China? This is kind of for anybody to answer, and sort of since they receive a lot of Venezuela's oil and their partnership, would it be that, maybe probably not, but I don't know if China would intervene, or how could it escalate, or I don't know.
I can jump in because that was actually a question that I was asked and I didn't answer on the panel. I was trying to avoid it because I thought, well, maybe if I talk about something else, he won't notice. But you clearly won't allow me to get away with that strategy. So no, it's all right. Just a couple quick points. Number one is I don't think we can assume or should assume that the Trump administration's approach on Venezuela is unpopular in Latin America. In fact, it is quite popular in some quarters, and some people want more of it. So this idea that you hear a lot in Washington circles, anyway, policy circles, that this is going to turn Latin America away from the United States, I think is a shallow analysis. I'm not saying that in some quarters it won't have that effect, but it's a much more nuanced approach. And it's not just Venezuela. You're seeing populations as far away as Ecuador, even Chile, countries like this, which say, yeah, we need to be tougher on crime. In fact, the elections in Chile and all around the region, Brian's done a lot of writing on this about, how elections are really being driven by the crime agenda at this point, at least in some countries. How will that impact the China-Venezuela relationship? In my view, not a lot. I don't see China sending Marines to save Maduro in Caracas. I don't see them taking on this as a cause célèbre at the UN. I don't see them being a strong, it's not a priority interest for them. Their priority interest is getting paid back the loans that they made some time ago, and perhaps continuing to occupy and annoy the United States in its own hemisphere so that we pay less attention to Taiwan and other areas that are of much more core strategic interest for China. It's not to say China will not try to take advantage of whatever the United States does if there is some sort of in-country strike, or if somehow The United States amplifies what's going on beyond the narco boats. Sure, China will make a lot of noise about that. Russia is already making lots of noise about that in RT and everywhere else, and the lawless administration and all these things. And they're trying to shape the public narrative about what's going on. But the direct relationship, I think what you're going to see, actually, if democracy returns to Venezuela, which I hope very much that it does, that in fact you're going to see the debtors of Venezuela line up first in line demanding to be paid. And they're actually going to be in a better place to get paid than under the bankrupt and corrupt Maduro regime, which doesn't have any resources to pay them back. And I'm not just talking now China, I'm talking about all the debtors of Venezuela, the bondholders, everybody else. And it's going to be an incredibly difficult road to go through for Venezuelans because, those are debts of the nation, not of Maduro. So, that's a whole separate conversation. But the point being is that China may actually find its interests more sustainable over the longer term with democracy in Venezuela. They bet on Chavez initially. They bet on Venezuela. The bet has turned sour, and now they're going to try to make the best of it if they can. But I don't sense that they're going to make this a strategic priority of China itself.
I agree with Eric's points. I would just add that, there are a couple things going on that we ought to consider as part of this, possible, there are a wide range of possible outcomes here, but to throw into the mix, right? One is that China is in the process right now, and this is not an entirely new thing, right? But really there's been an intensive focus domestically on stockpiling energy resources, minerals, and agriculture, right? And so this kind of harkens back to the early 2000s. This was part of the reason that Chinese companies went out in the region in the first place. And here we are again at a moment where China really feels the need to do this in the event of a future conflict. And it's really reflective of their views of what's happening with the United States and where things stand globally. But so on the one hand, that means that, oil everywhere and access to oil is important, and maintaining that access to oil, right? Be it equity oil or these agreements that ensure the exportation of oil to China. On the other hand, at this point, China issued about $65 billion in loans to Venezuela over time, right? And a lot of that was in exchange for oil. They've paid back most of it. The estimates are between 10 and 20 billion, so it's still a lot outstanding, right? But nevertheless, around 10 billion remains, right? So there's still quite a bit that needs to be shipped, but it's not as though we're talking about the full amount. There are a number of investments, right? So beyond this sort of, lending relationship, there are a number of investments, equity investments, some of which were made in for equity swaps, that also need to be considered. And to Eric's point, if there were a transition, either China will be really working to make sure that those are honored, right, or will find itself in a difficult position as many other debtor or creditors, right, come asking for payment. And so I think, as we saw, years ago now, which is hard to believe, in other moments of turmoil in Venezuela, that the China is really willing to work with both sides. It's done extensive outreach with the opposition. I remember walking into a hotel in Shanghai. This was, 9 years ago or something of that nature, and I opened up the drawer, where you have pencils and things. And I pulled out the brochure, and it was like people visiting this hotel over the past 5 years. And within the booklet, there were 5 members of the Venezuelan opposition pictured. And I said, well, why didn't I take that thing? I should have taken it. But it was really remarkable. There's tons of engagement. And this is true everywhere, right? It's not ideological. It's all just about making sure you have the right friends at the right moment to get what you need to get done commercially, politically, or otherwise.
Thank you. Another question?
Hi, my name is Garsaina Florestal, and I'm an FIU student. My question is, what would be in your opinion, in your view, any of you can answer, a alternative for strategic denial?
I think I say this, that's a great question. I was saying in my response that I would think about it as shaping what it means to access and really leverage space, right, or advanced technology, because I think it's the same for AI or geospatial technology, that it's so essential to make improved decisions. My answer is very non-sexy and kind of boring, but helping with institutional development and what that means. So I'll give you just a simple example when it comes to space. One of the reasons why the Space Force was created in the United States, there were many, but one of them was to create a permanent home for what are now the Guardians, this expertise that used to be kind of rotated from people in the Air Force and other services, spending a couple of years doing space and then, going back to different assignments. That is still the case in a lot of the countries in Latin America. And so in Brazil, for example, you get, again, airmen and women who spend a couple of years learning about space and then they move on, and the same in the diplomatic world. And so in space governance, very important. It takes almost as long to figure out the acronyms of the UN system. And then by the time you're ready, then you move on to another capital, right? And so that expertise on what your country cares about when it comes to, say, space security, which is so important, doesn't last. There are very few institutions for that. And institutions aren't just space agencies. They're institutions, right? And I think each country has, its say on what that looks like. But, as bad as sometimes our interagency kind of collaboration and all that looks like, we do have institutions and we have that ingrained expertise and those homes for people to develop that and kind of understand the strategic needs of the country and contribute to that. And so I would say, long answer, but I would say I would like to see more best practices, more kind of sharing of lessons learned about how we do institutional building, institutional engagement and collaboration on space issues. And I think that is something that China and our adversaries are not interested in doing, right? But that could really, I think, take root and build those lasting, more strategic relationships.
Thank you. Gentleman in second row.
First of all, thank you all for being here. My name is Alejandro Cuevas. I'm an ICCA scholar and a cybersecurity student from FIU as part of the fly-in. This question is for anybody, and there was a really good point brought up that this is a two-way street and that many countries of the region are asking for assistance from China and support, as also with their increase in influence in the area and the United States over-reliance on them for rare earth metals, 70%. They have gained leverage on us. What can the United States do to appeal to these countries and mitigate that impact?
So, I mean, this relates, I think, to the question that was just asked, right? I mean, it's a matter of assessing, first of all, what the region wants and needs, right? And taking that into account and viewing that sort of assessment and efforts to align Latin American interests with U.S. interests, right? And conceive of a hemispheric strategy, right? Not as a weakness, not as weakening U.S. prospects, but rather as building something far more sustainable, I think, and that will, create a hemisphere with the sorts of conditions that will promote prosperity well into the future. At the same time, I think what is needed, I mean, and I want to kind of answer that the question that was asked first and then relate it back to this. So what is it? What's an alternative to strategic denial, right? I mean, I think it's really just a matter of coming up with a much more holistic, comprehensive vision of what it is to engage, right, with the region in ways that supports the U.S. agenda, but also supports what Latin America is looking to achieve. And there are plenty of areas of intersection. They may not be the same ones that the region identifies vis-a-vis China, right? But there are going to be certain areas where we can make that happen. It's also creating the sorts of, partnerships from an economic perspective and otherwise, right, that ensure that countries feel that this partnership is valuable, that it's worth listening to the United States, that it's worth partnering with the United States on wide-ranging kinds of initiatives, whether domestically or whether regionally or globally. And so, I just want to tell this story. I keep talking about when I was in China, but this is this is a very long time ago at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. I sat down, and for whatever reason, the person I spoke to a Southeast Asia expert, right? And he said he thought I was Argentine. I have no idea why, and maybe he spoke more freely with me because of that. But he said, I said, well, what are your thoughts on the South China Sea? What's happening there? And he just laughed, and he said, we don't need to worry about that. All you need to do is have the sort of trade relationship in which a certain country depends on you as a market, right, for goods or for critical inputs for their own industries, and that problem is solved. I mean, that's a very simplistic interpretation of things, right? It may not always work, but certainly trade agreements, right? Things these sorts of engagements, or just really any engagements in a positive way at all, right? With a positive agenda in mind, are fundamental. And so, I'm not offering a very clear, step-by-step agenda here, but I think whether strategic denial and a positive agenda, right, in the Latin American context are in many ways interrelated, right?
Well, we're running out of time. Brian, what do you think? We have time for...
Yeah, I would add one more specific case in the rare earths and I'm not sure whether this is a alternative to strategic denial, but it's something that's happening in the region right now. Now that the Trump administration has shifted its stance on Brazil and is talking to the Lula government again in an effort to probably not roll back the tariffs, but at least stop escalating what they announced in July. Rare earths is at the center of those discussions. And it does look like a case of a possible win-win for both countries that is brought on by a classically transactional tactic from the Trump administration, but where the Lula government, despite its differences, both ideologically and its grievances at the way that they've been treated since July, where there's some genuine enthusiasm in Brasilia from the people who I talk to. Because Brazil is the world's second biggest reserves of rare earths. But so far, they have not successfully been able to exploit them. My understanding is that there's only one company operating in that sector right now. It's an American company, and they export their production to China so that it can then be brought back into the Western Hemisphere. All parties involved in this, for processing, yeah. And so everybody involved in this negotiation sees the potential upside because they know, of course, that Brazil's number two. Who's number one? It's China. And so this is actually not an area where China is likely to come in and invest because they already have a lot of these materials themselves. On the other side of the equation, I think, it's clear that rare earths are very much at the center of this confrontation, this new confrontation between Washington and Beijing that we saw erupt last week. And my understanding is that not just the Trump administration, but our defense community, let's say, is acutely aware of the risks to our own supply chains if the rare earths from China get cut off. And in their view, what better potential partner on this than Brazil? So it's an interesting case of collaboration and mutual economic interest that is overcoming not just an ideological divide, but like two boxers who have thrown plenty of punches at each other over the last 3 months or so. And, in as much as the administration and future administrations can think of other cases like that, where we can build something that is clearly of mutual interest to all the countries, that's the alternative to this kind of very confrontational approach that I think, as I've already said this, I think often attempts at strategic denial risk backfiring as often as they succeed.
And then at a tactical level, just very quickly, a tactical level, stop talking about it, right? The more that we say we're trying to deny somebody access to the Western Hemisphere, what does that do? It incentivizes people to say, I'm going to prove you wrong for political reasons, both the Chinese and the Brazilians and everybody else. So it's like, all right, enough with the new Monroe Doctrine or whatever it is.
Well, maybe we should erase any evidence that we had this discussion today then.
I don't work for the government.
Well, We are finishing our panel. Please, I'm asking you for an applause for our experts. And Dr. Fonseca, the floor is yours.
No, JP, thank you so much. What an incredibly thoughtful panel. Thank you so much for the insights on this concept of strategic denial or not. But I think, again, what Eric said resonates. Let's stop talking about it. It's about how we show up and how we engage and how we compete within the region in our own context. That's ultimately going to win the day. So we're going to go on a brief 15-minute break, and we'll be back pretty sharp. Actually, it's going to be a little bit less than 15 minutes, but we'll be back here at 6 p.m. sharp to kick off the next panel. Thank you. Okay, we're going to get started. If everyone can take their seats. I have to use. If everyone can take their seats. Oh, hello. Hello, hello. If everyone can take their seats, we're going to get started, guys. We're going to get started. Sorry. Let's get started. Ready? Okay. All right. I took your mic. Dan is here. Oh, nice. All right. Here we go. We are back, but can you hear? I'm trying. There we go. Okay. Is that better? Testing, testing. I'm trying not to use marine voice. I'm old and I can't project. I don't have it anymore. No, I'm old and we'll talk afterwards. Hey, Brian. All right, here we go. We're gonna get started now. Sorry. If not, we'll be here until 10 o'clock tonight, and I'm not sure you guys are in for that. All right. Well, welcome back. Thank you all for sticking in with us for the remainder of the night. 2 more sessions. We're on, I guess what they say in golf, the back 9. So here we go. We're on the last 2 sessions of the evening. So it's my privilege now to turn the floor over to Dr. Carlos Solar, a scholar that we at FIU had the opportunity to work with for a number of years. He's a senior fellow in all-out ninja intellectually at the Royal United Services Institute in London. And so we're grateful for the partnership that we have at RUSI. And so, Carlos, I turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Brian. This panel is titled Crime Across Borders, State and Non-State Actors in the Shadows, and let me add, also in plain daylight. And I think it's so topical and timely to be discussing this with 4 experts on thematic experts and case study experts and country experts. So this is a very polyphacetic type of researchers that you guys have in front of you. So let me introduce Vanda Felber-Brown, who's the director of the Initiative on Non-State Armed Actors at the Brookings Institutions. We have Daniel Schaefer, who is works at Pew, leading the International Fisheries Project. Did I get it correct from the website there? Brilliant. And then we have Jill Guerra, who is an immigration policy analyst at the Niskanen Center. And then Professor John Polga Hesimovich, teaching political science at the U.S. Naval Academy. So, Vanda, we've talked about probably 3 of the main case studies that you've been following lately: Haiti, Brazil, on different stuff more related to politics rather than to the criminal governance of the PCC and the Comando Vermelho. And then also about, probably less in this conference, about Mexican criminal groups. I won't ask you to speak from in a perspective that you can bunch them all together, because I believe they're quite different things on its own. But if we could start with Haiti, for instance. Haiti usually is up in the news. This year, we had quite a bloody season earlier. Then we had news about an international mission. And now it seems to be a little bit out of the radar, at least compared to other stuff that the U.S. is doing. So how do we raise awareness about Haiti in the countries where the spillovers of what's happening there are making more waves?
Great, thank you. I will talk about Haiti, but let me a little bit set the broader stage with the set of issues that you, Carlos, raised. So the title of the panel involves state in the shadows, or actors in the shadows. And there are 2 ways to think about that. One is situations where governmental actors or states outright sponsor criminality because they are engaged in criminality themselves, or because they use crime as a tool of their foreign policies, their geostrategic engagement. The other way to think about it is when the state is overshadowed by the criminal groups. And there is no better case in Latin America than the case of Haiti, where the state is hanging on bare thread and has been hanging on bare thread. Criminal gangs, which have long thought of as being very primitive in Haiti and nowhere having the sophistication of Mexican cartels or groups like the Primero Comando de Capital, have nonetheless succeeded in controlling the vast majority of the capital and areas significantly beyond the capital. They control strategic roads, they control access to several departments, and departments are the administrative units of Haiti. And they have developed a beachhead or significant presence beyond the capital. In many ways, they exercise far more power over daily life in Haiti than does the government, than does the state, and even sometimes than do economic interests, corporate interests in the country. And this all came to a head when in the spring of 2024, the Haitian gangs toppled the government of then Prime Minister Ariel Henry, and a new government was instituted. A very dramatic spring where the gangs, in my view, were trying to get a seat directly or indirectly via proxies in the government. Ultimately, that did not happen, and instead, the international community, under the leadership of the United States, was finally able to mobilize an international force that authorized by the United Nations, the Multilateral Security Force for Haiti, MSSM, that was supposed to work with the vestiges, tiny vestiges of the Haitian state, such as the Haitian National Police, to defeat the gangs or at least substantially weaken them. None of that happened. And the year since the MSSM arrived, being staffed far less than had been expected, than had been hoped for, was essentially a year of just slowing down the degradation and capacity of the state and slowing down the rate of security deterioration in the country where half of the population is either in famine or at least food insecure, where murders are taking place at a very high rate, where people are losing their lives to the gangs, where they are losing their livelihoods, their homes to the gangs, where in many parts of the country, daily life is absolutely horrendous, without having any of the exposure that horrendous situations have elsewhere in the world. And part of the reason why there is limited international attention is the difficulties of dealing with Haiti, lots of historic precedents where efforts to stabilize Haiti, improve Haiti, have failed. Another reason is, of course, massive crises going on from Gaza to Sudan to, until recently, the DRC and other places. So there is big international fatigue. There's been the cutoff of foreign aid by the Trump administration, and other countries are slowing down aid. Now, the mandate of the MSSM expired in October. And if the MSSM had left without any replacement, we would have seen the state officially collapsing to the gangs and Haiti becoming a crime republic, facilitating all manner of criminality, including drug trafficking, at a scale far beyond what's currently going on in Haiti. The Trump administration, and particularly Ambassador Worcester, pulled a magic rabbit out of the hat and were able to generate an international agreement for a new force, a gang suppression force, that is supposed to replace the MSSM within 16 months. A force that is supposed to be far more capacious in its staffing, in its resources, as well as in its ambitions. Now, if this gang suppression force materializes and does start acting in the way that it's mandated, we will see some improvements in security. How large they are yet to be seen. Now, we have to hope that the force is actually composed, that it will actually be staffed, that we will see the numbers. But Haiti is in many ways emblematic of what we heard on the previous panel. Brian and Eric talked about the fact how crime has been dominating politics in Latin America, and how criminal groups have become a center of public policy and public efforts because they have become enormously powerful and enormously multifaceted. And because they engage in many economies, many activities beyond drug trafficking. Take the PCC, its involvement is very much in legal economies, in the ethanol industry, in other aspects of not just illegal domains, but legal domains. Mining, we spoke on the previous panel about the rare earths. Mining is certainly an area where criminal groups from the Mexican cartels to the PCC, to the Gulf cartel, and smaller groups in Colombia are all involved, whether they're chasing gold, the predominant commodity they have been focusing on, or logging, or being involved in illegal fishing. But in many of these domains, these very powerful, enormously violent criminal groups are acting, are growing in of themselves because the state capacity has been so enormously weak. And because in Latin America, police forces, despite decades of US efforts, have failed to generate deterrence capacity as well as incapacitation capacity. And I'll add here by saying that there is a lot of desire to look for external sources of the behavior of the criminal groups. And we can talk, I hope we'll have a chance to talk about Chinese criminal groups in Latin America, for example. But the problem of crime is a problem that is a manifestation of decades of internal problems, external failures to mitigate the problems, to offer effective law enforcement, now resulting in both popularity for authoritarian militarized regimes, as well as attracting actors like China that are selling left and right technologies, such as safe and smart cities, and other versions of law enforcement technology, promising to resolve the problems of crime through its digital law enforcement power.
Thank you, Wanda. That's a great segue for our next speaker, Daniel. If we zoom out from Haiti, and please feel free to make more geographic comparisons to this. Haiti, it's at the heart of the Caribbean Sea, which makes it a port of destiny to many of the drug trafficking, which is today at the news, given the recent U.S. actions in the Caribbean Sea. So, how are maritime spaces being positioned as a new place for, not the new place, but as the, one of the most interesting places that we could be looking today at transnational organized crime, the logistical routes between countries producing drugs and those markets such as North America and so on. And my point of, if you can zoom out of the Caribbean Sea, what's the comparison with other places? And I'm sure that through your research you've been looking at in the Western Hemisphere. Thanks.
Thank you. I had to keep this short. Promise myself I will talk about fish. Bruce has known me for several years, and I will talk about this for a week if you let me. So if I go too long, let me know. Hard to follow you. That is some very heavy topics. Land-based crime is not my forte, and it is more than I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is the ocean and fisheries and what fish is. Now, first question I have is why would we be at AUSA talking about fish? Why am I talking blue in a sea of green? Why does the Army care about fish? Why does anybody focused on land care about the fish side? The first thing I'll say is fish is not just fish. I work for a nonprofit, I work for an NGO, but I used to work for the Coast Guard for nearly 30 years doing fisheries enforcement. It's what I do for Pew now. I work with other countries to work on their fisheries capacity development, their training, and other areas. And right now we're focusing on the southern cone of South America, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil. Very specifically because they have the interest and the desire to want to do something about something that's happening off their coastlines that people do not pay attention to. It's usually out of sight, out of mind. Nobody pays attention to what's on the water. And what's happening is a degradation of their fisheries resources through a number of sources. And I'm not going to get completely into China. I'm just going to say in general that there are foreign as well as domestic problems that are challenging the resources, the extractive resources that is the fish in these waters. So you need to stop and look at fish not as a thing you want to preserve ecologically, but something as a source of food in many cases, primary source of protein. It's also a lot of the employment in many of the smaller communities, coastal communities, Central South America, even the Caribbean. And it's also generating revenue for countries. Now, it doesn't seem like a lot when you look at other resources, but several $1 billion is a lot of money. And when it's an extractive resource as renewable is not being taken care of, that causes problems. That's only part of the issue. But what it really is you look at illegal fishing is more of a symptom of a larger problem of maritime governance, or lack thereof. Are you able to exert your authority in areas that you have sovereignty over? Are you able to protect your borders, in this case the maritime borders, from any sort of illicit threat, or is it just something that's impervious that just happens? If you look back to criminal justice theory, Rudy Giuliani, I can't believe I'm using his name in a positive way, but broken window theory, being what it is simply that if you allow small things to happen in a criminal world, larger things will follow. If small things are left unchecked, bigger things follow. So in the world of fisheries, if you are unregulated, you have rules and you have no consequences of those rules, you can do what you want with impunity, yeah, it's just fish. It's just a regulation. But nobody's checking the governance. So what else are you going to do? Again, and for the sake of brevity, I'm going to mention a couple areas and not get into detail. Somali piracy was started as a way of protecting their fishery resources by local communities that led to much larger issues we're all aware of. And there's some other examples where the resource extraction protection led to bigger issues, such as Somali piracy. So it is a lack of governance. And when it comes to the interest of the U.S. military, whatever you want to call it is, whether it's ocean or maritime-based or whether it's land-based, the problem is simply instability in a country caused by the lack of governance. And if you can take steps to prevent that governance in one area from degrading and becoming solid, then you can then take steps further in, little bits at a time. So when it comes to dealing with fisheries and capacity, and U.S., particularly when it comes downrange, is looking at the interests of our partners downrange and what they want, not what we're telling them they need. You look at they need help with capacity. We talked about in the first panel, enduring capacity and capability to do basic law enforcement functions. Enduring capacity and capabilities to have basic institutions in place. Institutions, permanency. These are things that can be done on the maritime side better than they can or quicker than they can on this land side, but perhaps can transfer over. And when it comes to the interests of the U.S., why would people want to deal with fisheries? That's a Coast Guard thing as far as U.S. Navy is concerned, but that's not true. It's about developing proficiency of tradecraft. So if you're going to do a fisheries boarding, for example, where does it start and what's the difference between that and a drug boarding or a migrant boarding or other trafficking issues? What you look for at the end. Up to that point, and gathering intelligence collection material from different sources, partners or otherwise, analyzing that data, disseminating that data, identifying the target, operations, sending out the vessel to intercept, conducting boarding operations, doing the basic boarding evolution from start. That's all the same stuff. The difference is fish. There are a lot of fishing boats out there, and most of them are legal. So you have these entities such as the navies and coast guards of these countries out there practicing this proficiency of tradecraft, gathering intelligence, analyzing the intelligence, sending the boats after the targets, boarding the targets. The difference is what they look for at the end, but up to that point, everything is the same. So now you have a proficient source. You also have something that's showing value to the country, value added. Why is a country paying for a navy to do fish? Why is a country paying for the navy to exist? This can demonstrate value to the local population that relies upon the fish for employment and or food and national revenue as something they see as tangible for the Navy to address, which means the Navy can have more resources and address the higher level threats such as drug, narcotics, and other things in addition to doing fisheries. It's kind of like cutting your teeth. And an example that I give you is the U.S. Coast Guard years ago, dating myself, the Pacific Area Commander would make the cutters going down to do drug operations in the Caribbean and Central America go to Alaska first before they're allowed to go south. Why? Because when you go to Alaska on a cutter for 90 days, you're going to do 60, 70, 80 boardings on fishing vessels. You may not find anything wrong, but you're doing the boardings. The ship is doing, again, proficiency of operations. So when I go to the Caribbean, where in a 90-day patrol back in the day, you might do 5 boardings. You're not wondering how to do things, you know. Now you're just focusing on finding the narcotics. So again, you're developing that proficiency. So looking beyond fish as a fish thing, but more as a development of establishing and maintaining governance, establishing enduring capabilities for the maritime forces, And when it comes to how the land forces can support the maritime forces, again, going back to intelligence, where does some of the intelligence expertise reside with the collection and analysis? Where does logistics reside? And where are other avenues where the land forces themselves can support the maritime in order to get the governance, to show governance, to exert authority on your areas of sovereignty and ensure the safety of your country. So fish is not just fish, it's more of an opportunity to develop that maritime governance, and then hopefully if that develops the maritime side, it translates to some of the more serious issues shore side. No, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Daniel. We move to another subject of moving parts, not fish, but people, which also seems to be in the hot debate of lack of governance. Irregular migration. Jill, you've been looking at Chinese, Russian, Iranian nationals moving through Latin America, ending up at the southern border of the U.S. Can you tell us a little bit more on how concerned policymakers are, how concerned they should be about the overall effects of this type of migration?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for moderating this panel, and thank you for Brian for inviting me. I have worked with FIU students before, always love working with FIU students, especially students from the Gordon Institute. So if any of you are interested in the topics that I cover, my center, the Niskanen Center, does have paid internships here in DC. In the summer, you can find and talk to me. I say that as a bribe to make you pay attention at a 6 p.m. panel. Several of you straightened up, though, so it's good to see that bribes still work. To give you a very kind of brief overview of my research, I recently wrote a paper for FIU through the Analytic Outreach Series on irregular migration from China, Russia, and Iran. So to condense all of it, I'll speak very briefly about what we should not be worried about and then what we should be worried about. What we should not be worried about at this stage is any kind of mass infiltration by China, Russia, or Iran at the southern border. I don't think that there's been any kind of mass insertion for espionage purposes. And the reason why I think so many policymakers have been concerned about this, there's a great book by Amy Zegart called Spies, Lies, and Algorithms. Chapter 2 talks about the ways that policymakers' minds and concepts of intelligence have been shaped really by sort of spy-tainment or spy shows, spy books, things of that nature. So if that's your only interaction with intelligence and with how different kinds of campaigns operate, then you might think, okay, well, why wouldn't China, Russia, and Iran be sending some highly trained commando through the southern border to try to stay here and be good cover? And there are a number of reasons for why that's possible, it's feasible, but it's not very likely, and it's certainly not likely at scale. The first and foremost one being that being an undocumented immigrant is exceptionally poor cover. The kind of people that they oftentimes try to insert, you need to have sort of a reason for being in the United States. You need to have something that can prevent you from being immediately removed. You're going to look very suspicious if you've just entered here and you can't legally work, you have no sort of legal source of income, you have no other kind of access to anything that would help you form a cover. You're also just not going to have access to the kind of materials and infrastructure that those countries in particular want. It's a little different with Iran because they have more of a relationship with terrorism. But if you're China, for example, if you're just trying to get people to come here and take photos of military bases as they've done that primarily through tourist visas. They haven't done that for people coming across the border. They've really tried to get people into sensitive areas where you have better cover, for example, you're a student, et cetera. And secondly, if you actually look at the data on where these migrant groups are entering from, you can see pretty clearly early on that there are things that don't make sense if it actually was at least en masse state directed. So there's famously direct flights that have occurred between Tehran and Caracas. But if you look at the Colombian data, all of the Iranians that have been encountered in Colombia have been encountered at the border with Ecuador, which means that they're starting from somewhere further south. They're not coming in from Venezuela, unless they're taking a very circuitous route, for example, around there. So I'm not worried, for example, about mass infiltration. In that sense, I do think that there's a big connection with two areas, one of which is crime. There are one of which Daniel pointed out, is sort of this concept of cutting teeth. So on one hand, it has been proven that some of the Chinese migrants, for example, that come to the southern border wind up in heavily Chinese American communities where they are lured by false job ads and then wind up working in marijuana farms. They enter an ad for something like babysitting or something in the informal sector, and they wind up being used by Chinese criminal groups here in the United States for things like marijuana farming. With the Russians, there have been instances where Russian migrants who came through the border have been found to have been suspected of then acquiring boats to help facilitate other kinds of human smuggling, especially on the coast of off of South Florida. And with Iranians, again, I think that's actually where most of the concern ought to be, although that's not where most of the concern has been. The majority of notable Iranian cases have involved forged passports. So if you're thinking, of this case of, say, cutting teeth or kind of doing preparatory work, you can think of, China, Russia, and Iran maybe seeing this as an opportunity to see, okay, well, how easy is it to infiltrate the southern border? We know that there have been former Wagner members, for example, found at the southern border. They might be trying to test out, what kind of passport forgery documentations do and do not work, what does and does not get detected. So in the future, if we do want to insert someone, we can actually give them false documentations that will elude U.S. detection systems or allied detection systems. That's really where I see most of the things that we ought to be concerned about. And I think that in many ways, the intersection between foreign policy and immigration has been ignored for so long that we simply don't have very many good solutions that work at this intersection. For example, Iran, during the era where we had the tensions around the strike on their nuclear facilities, apparently told the U.S. that they had agents here in the U.S. that had come in through the border under Biden and were prepared to strike. One of the headlines that came out after this, we had a major operation to sweep up Iranian agents. One of them, a former Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps sniper, was found and deported. And on one hand, that's good. On the other hand, we've now sent an active sniper back to Iran, where he presumably could continue to shoot at our Israeli allies, shoot at others. There are many other instances where, for example, if you're concerned about the Chinese migrants being potential spies, the answer so far from people who are more skeptical, who are more hawks, is, well, we should just deport them instead of using them for, say, something like a spy swap or putting them through more kind of intensive interrogation around intelligence, which to me kind of betrays the fact that this is not really being viewed at this point as a security angle. It's being viewed primarily as an immigration issue first and a security angle second, but I do think that that second angle matters a lot for policy and ultimately for what you do with those migrants.
Thanks, Jill, for raising those interesting points about how to call the attention of policymakers, which actually leads me to John's, one of his latest papers. It's called The Venezuelan Transnational Organized Crime and the Venezuelan State, published at the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs. John, it seems that someone read your paper at the heart of government and they decided to take action recently. Can you tell us a little bit more about TOC and Venezuela, please?
They didn't ask me what action to take, though. That's the thing. Thank you so much. Thank you to Dr. Brian Fonseca for the invitation, for FIU and Rusi and Athena Lab for hosting and organizing this event. This is terrific. What a beautiful space. This is my first time here, and I live right up the street, so I will be back for sure. I can talk about all sorts of things in Latin America, but it's the Venezuela stuff that seems to be hitting a lot right now. So I recently published a co-edited volume about Venezuela called Authoritarian Consolidation in Times of Crisis, Venezuela under Nicolás Maduro. And I was actually supposed to present those findings through an analytic outreach with FIU at Southcom the day that the first boat was struck. Yes, so I did not engage in that briefing. I have this article, and I also have an article that was published this year with Fabiana Pereira, which is about the deterioration, the asymmetric deterioration of U.S.-Venezuelan defense relations. So I don't think anyone's read that, so I'm like advertising it here. There has been a lot of misinformation, and a lot of misperceptions regarding transnational organized crime and non-state armed actors in Venezuela, as well as their relationship to the Venezuelan state. We have heard Tren de Aragua and Carta de los Soles bandied about quite a bit in recent months, and they've taken on increased salience in policy circles and defense circles. And I hope that maybe I can shed some light on that and bring a little more nuance to the discussion. As Vanda has spent at least part of her career showing the world criminal governance flourishes in poorly governed or ungoverned spaces, right? Places where the state is weak, inefficient, or corrupt. And as a result, it's no surprise that Venezuela is going to be a center for transnational organized crime because of the incredible weakness of that state. But that's not anything new, right? This is something that actually dates back to before Chavismo, actually, right? To the 1990s even. But this certainly takes off after Hugo Chavez comes to power. So in my essay, what I look at is several things, but kind of the focus of the essay is 4 ways in which the Venezuelan state is tied to organized crime. And I say, first of all, protection of transnational criminal organizations, complicity in fostering their development. I'm going to unpack these. As an exporter of transnational organized crime. And then, as Vanda just said, 20 minutes ago, the state itself acts as an organization of transnational crime, right? And so this makes fighting it very difficult, all 4 of these factors. So I'll walk through one by one these 4 factors and then talk about maybe or suggest some ways in which we might mitigate, we, the international community, might mitigate the effects of transnational organized crime and fight it in Venezuela, right? So the first thing is protection for TCOs. This is a state that since Hugo Chavez came to power, gave safe haven to Colombian guerrillas, right? To members of the ELN and the FARC that essentially sought places to stay while they were, in some cases, even on vacation, right, from engaging in guerrilla activities in Colombia. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but I actually was in an airfield, an improvised airstrip in Apure State a decade ago, and I was with someone who had his, how do you say becerro in English? He had his calves stolen off his hato, and to resolve it, the National Guard said, we don't deal with that. Here the state is the FARC, so you gotta go talk to the FARC. And so he went to talk to the FARC, but the FARC was on vacation because it was Christmas, right? And so it's that level of embeddedness of these organizations that has existed since at least 1999, right? But beyond guerrilla groups, Chavismo also helped foster the emergence of collectives in urban areas of the country, initially in Caracas, and then in Maracaibo and Valencia and other cities. They also purposefully didn't go after the street gangs or the bandas that became later mega bandas that supported the government. And lastly, they turned the other way when the sindicatos or syndicates emerged in eastern Venezuela in the Orinoco mining arc, because they were able to use those wildcat mining groups that then organized to extort to help support the regime. Okay, so there's a great deal of protection that the state has afforded transnational organized crime in the country. The second thing that I point to is the complicity in fostering the development of these TCOs. And the biggest example and the best example we have of this is Tren de Aragua, right? Which emerges in Maracay or around Maracay in Aragua State in probably 2015. And it's not out of a failed railway project that it's often reported. They took their name from Tren del Llano, which is another gang that is now much less salient. And the Tren de Aragua grew out of what's known as the Pranato. And the Pranato, for those of you unfamiliar with this, is this absurd system that existed in which the Ministry of Prisons devolved prison authority to the most powerful inmates of each prison rather than manage the prisons themselves. And they did this in exchange for those people promising essentially peace and stability in the prisons that were kind of at that point host to a series of massacres. And so the government gave these pranes, as they're known, power, and they would have, there are famous pictures on the internet of the Minister of Prisons, Iris Varela, hugging, right, bear hugging some of these gang leaders. And Tren de Aragua emerges out of this, right? And there's a kind of 3 figures, Lari Changa, who right now has been caught in Colombia, right, and others. And so this wouldn't exist if not for the Venezuelan state. And it happens under late Chavismo, but really this is the beginning of Madurismo. Maduro takes Chavez's acceptance of these non-state armed actors and dials it up to 10. The third thing that has happened under Maduro is not on purpose, but it's a consequence of the country's humanitarian, economic, and political crisis, which is the emigration of 8 million Venezuelans. And along with those people were members of Tren de Aragua and other bandas, right? And other criminal organizations. In part, they left because they could no longer extort people the way they could have before, because there wasn't enough money to extort in times of economic crisis. So the state unwittingly causes this crisis, well, unwittingly, I don't know, but causes the crisis, unwittingly sends these groups abroad to Colombia, Peru, Chile, and other places, and a little bit the United States, okay? And lastly, we have the state itself, which acts as a transnational actor of organized crime, right? In trafficking of gold and coltan and other minerals from the Eastern Mining Arc, trafficking drugs, trafficking coltan, and that's where we have Cartel de los Soles, which is a diffuse network of generally junior officers who engage in narco-trafficking. The narco-sobrinos, in other cases, directly tied to the central government, has a more kind of tenuous relationship to the so-called Cartel de los Soles. Nonetheless, it is transnational in its scope, okay? So with all of this, what can be done? Well, the first big problem is that fighting organized crime anywhere requires political will, right? And unfortunately, a lot of these groups support the government in power in Venezuela, and so right now, with the status quo, there's not the political will to fight these groups, right? And we can think of other cases in Latin America right now where this political will might also be weak, right? Another place I study is Ecuador, and because of ties between organized crime and the state, there are questions as to how justice might actually go after those bad actors. The second thing is simple state capacity, and this is something that is universal. I think everyone on this panel so far has said the word capacity, right? And I think that has to be the centerpiece of discussion, not a question of narcotics, of just the supply and demand question, but of states enforcing their borders. Do you know why those people, generally what I know of Ecuador, and I lived in Ecuador, immigrants from Iran and across the globe come to the United States through Ecuador because they don't have the visa requirements that other states do, right? And so that leads to the third point, which is it requires international coordination, right? The point that you raised requires coordination between the United States and Ecuador. Venezuela requires coordination with Colombia. It requires coordination with Brazil, with Trinidad, with every other state, with the United States. And that's problematic because if there's a government in power that is the sworn enemy of another government, they're not going to work together. And so that makes things really, really difficult. No matter who is in charge, fighting this is going to be a big challenge in Venezuela. Whether it's Maduro, whether it's someone else within Madurismo, or whether it's someone from the opposition. And so they need to take this quite seriously in a day after scenario as well. Thanks, I think I talked a lot, I apologize.
We started 4 minutes past the hour, so I'm gonna take a 2-minute extra time for the Q&A. So the floor is open. Thank you so much. That was literally a tour de force in illicit economies and criminal governance. So I thank the speakers. The floor is open for questions. Yep, Frank, please, front row.
The criminal groups have taken out our lighting.
The shadow.
Right.
Vanda, just a question on Haiti, and you've gotten this question many times, but we focus so much on what the United Nations is doing or not doing, or what the United States is doing. But as we always say, all this is well and good, but the internal situation, the internal political situation is what's going to define. And it just seemed that we get caught up so much in the discussion about how the external can help the internal that we sort of take for granted that somehow the domestic political dynamic either doesn't matter or can be resolved by external actors. Is there a way for you to determine really how important this internal is? Thank you.
Well, Frank, what you are asking is, of course, fundamental. The issue of internal politics and internal governance as being the magic sauce that makes external intervention work is ever present and fundamental. Whether we're talking Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Colombia, if internal governance is defined as power politicking at the expense of producing any kind of public good, then the external intervention will run to ground. And no matter how much the external actors seek to foster the building of institutions, if at the core the politics are about zero-sum political game and not governance, then the external effort to foster institution will produce little outcomes. Unfortunately, in Haiti, internal politics continue to be enormously problematic. They continue to be defined as zero-sum games, even at times of utmost crisis. So we had an utmost crisis in the spring of 2024. The government collapsed, and the gangs came this close to taking over. Miraculously, the MSSM parachutes in the country, and we see steady deterioration of security. One would hope that the political elite would come to realize that they no longer have the gangs on a leash, that the gangs threaten the very survival of their political interest, of their economic interest. And of course, the political actors, the business actors have for decades used criminal groups. They have serviced their political agendas, their economic agendas. The problem is that the criminals are not on the leash and they dictate the terms. And yet we haven't seen significant improvements in politics. The Transitional Presidential Council has been ripped apart by disagreements, by vicious politics, has also been enormously implicated in corruption. And we are, of course, heading to the end of this political dispensation. There was expectation that by February 2026, we will have elections, which we haven't had in Haiti for a number of years. The elections will not take place. The mandate of the transitional system will come to an end. Now, one would hope, one would expect that Haitian politicians, that Haitian corporate interests, civil society, which is very impressive in Haiti, like in other parts of Latin America, will all come together and put forth a new alternative vision of what will happen in February 26. Instead, there is looking forward to what the U.S. will do, what the U.S. will say, what CARICOM will do, CARICOM will say. But beyond Haiti, Frank, there is only so much one can do from the outside if the internal remains dysfunctional. It's like a patient going to a doctor or being sent to a doctor, or doctor emerging at the house of the patient and saying, take this medicine, do X, Y, and Z. If the patient is not willing or capable, then we will end up with the Taliban's in power. It's the story of Afghanistan, it's the story of Somalia, it's the story of many systems. Now, every so often, the crisis becomes such that the elite is shaken up and says, okay, we need to be more inclusive, we need to be less divisive, but it's hard to do.
Thank you, Vanda. Yes, Brian at the back.
I project well, but I thank you for the microphone. There's been a lot of commentary about a potentially impending shift of politics in the region to the right, driven by an increased focus in many countries on security and organized crime. Does that, if it comes to pass, does it make you any more hopeful about the bandwidth that governments will dedicate to some of the issues that you've been speaking about today? Do you see any kind of material change, or will these governments likely struggle with the same challenges, such as lack of resources, that you've also been describing? Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. That's a great question that probably the remaining speakers could address for a minute or so that we end up on time. Daniel, can we start with you? And my question to you, having a little bit of a moderator's privilege, was, can you factor in climate change as well, and how that is moving illegal fishing into other aspects?
I'm going to give you the... Yeah, there's no such thing.
If you agree with climate change, of course.
Yeah. So the first question.
Yeah, go ahead.
On the fishery side, in the 4 countries we're working with, we actually have seen an increase in political will and a desire to address the problems in the maritime domain. Both fisheries, trafficking, forced labor, all the maritime issues that are out there, all 4 of those countries have taken a step forward and are committing more resources. So there is more political will. Where that's coming from, I can't tell you, other than we've developed 3 years of trust with these governments to look at things from a different perspective and different view, and that has changed their perspective on and how it serves their own self-interests. There's always the return on investment of everything. Nobody does anything for free. Governments the same way. So I think what's happening is they're seeing the value in putting forth these resources in a way that is getting the return on their investment of their money, time, and political will. That's on the fishery side. As far as climate goes, in South America, not a whole lot, honestly. Most of the climate change is dealing with fisheries is happening in the tropics and the moving of resources of both from bleaching and degradation of fish stocks to moving of fish stocks in areas they weren't before to moving out of areas where they were to other areas that are contested. But that's for another week. I can talk on that one. But thank you.
Gil?
Yes, there's another great and seminal book in this field called Weapons of Mass Migration by Kelly Greenhill. And the theory that she puts forth is basically that liberal democracies are the ones that struggle the most when migration is weaponized, because they have to care both about the well-being of the migrants and also domestic constituencies, whereas illiberal governments who don't really care about how they treat migrants who also can ignore some of the demands of migrant-friendly constituencies in their own countries have more options, or at least are not as susceptible to this. So I think that one of the things that we've seen across the political spectrum is really a lot of cooperation on immigration enforcement, regardless of the political leading of that country. Obviously, some countries like El Salvador take it further, but the best case for this is Nicaragua, which under the Biden administration relaxed some of their visa policies for countries from Africa, in particular Mauritania, to try to get migrants from outside of the hemisphere to come to the border as a way of pressuring the Biden administration over sanctions. The second that Trump won the election, they started publishing statistics through the Bank of Nicaragua about how their international flights from Africa were going down dramatically. They've started to really ramp up their cooperation with the U.S. administration over deportation flights. So I think you really see something, because the U.S. has made it such a priority, I think it doesn't really matter so much necessarily whether the governments in Latin America are right-wing or left-wing. It's really the posture of the U.S. administration in place that matters, that determines how those governments respond to that, whether they think that they can use it against the U.S. or whether they worry that if they keep doing this, the U.S. will actually retaliate against them.
Brian, I'm interested in your own answer to your question, but I will offer that I'm hopeful that will make a difference, but I'm not an optimist. I'm a pragmatist, and any change depends on the policy put into place by domestic governments, right? And so, is it paz total a la Petro? Because if that's the plan, then I don't think it's going to work. Is it a Bukele-esque crackdown in a place where a Bukele-esque crackdown isn't going to work, a la Noboa in Ecuador? Because if that's the case, that's also not going to work. As we see right now, as we mentioned in the break, Ecuador is on pace to have the highest homicide rate in its country's history this year after having implemented these crackdowns, right? And so there have to be smart policies put into place as well. Not just, we have security cooperation, we're going to go after the bad guys, that's enough. No, it has to be done with an eye towards the future, taking into account expertise of the people on the ground in those places. That was 1 minute.
It was.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Jan. Well, please, before I hand over to Brian, join me in a round of applause to our speakers.
Thank you, Carlos, Vanda, Dan, Gil, and of course, John. This was a masterclass in non-state actors operating the hemisphere, so thank you so much. I appreciate your thoughtfulness. All right, we're going to call up our final session of the evening. So those that are in the trenches with us, to use a Association of the U.S. Army adjacent term, in the trenches, we're going to have this amazing final discussion. Yeah, sit in the middle, and then I'll do a brief introduction. Of course, General, I'll turn it over to you. So I'm excited about this last session on the future of war, and to walk us through that, We have two incredible thought leaders. I'll introduce them briefly. Hey guys, we're in a session. Sorry, we're gonna move on. All right. Should I use Marine voice? I feel like I'm not being assertive with the, Renee is shaking profusely. Okay. All right. Well, let me introduce first and foremost Brigadier General Terry Boris, who, again, has a long list of accolades serving in very senior levels of the U.S. Army Reserve, and of course in U.S. Army proper. I won't give all of those, but certainly grateful to have you here, and Dr. Peter Singer, who I've had the opportunity to work with for a number of years. Both of them have web pages and dissertations of pedigree and accolades. But the two things I think are coolest is both of them are considered mad scientists in the U.S. Army. And that is a designation that I think both of them wear proudly. And that is a quasi-formal designation as a mad scientist. But we're going to have an opportunity to listen to two U.S. Army mad scientists work through the future of warfare. So with that, General, I turn it over to you.
Okay, there we go. So thank you, Brian, for the invitation today. If we were to tell you the story of how I got to be here, it'd be pretty comical, and two, at the same time, boring. So you guys today, as I've listened to the discussions, have really been talking about strategy and regional conflicts and how we look at the Western Hemisphere and how we should be thinking about the Western Hemisphere. And I was particularly interested, that is my area of expertise for the service. And so I am completely encouraged at what I heard today, at the questions from the crowd, because you are thinking about what we need to be thinking about for the future. And that really segues into right now, because what we're looking at is, what does that future look like? It is not going to be as much what you think of today as what it can be. And so Brian asked me to put together a bunch of questions, which I did. And then in typical mad scientist realm, we threw the questions out and said, we're gonna do one question and then kind of riff on where we see technology. And with your permission, I would say we could open it to questions from the group and battle that field together.
Sounds good.
So I'll start with the first question, just to kind of get us started, because I think technology is reshaping how we look at not just the world, but diplomacy, politics, deterrence, military, you name it. And so you've written that AI and autonomy are changing the math of conflict itself. It's altering the cost, the scale, and the tempo. So which factor now defines real advantage? Speed, precision, or authenticity? And then that's it.
Great question. Let me start also just by thanking FIU. We've had a great partnership over the years with the university, so it's always great. This is, although this is my first time in the Washington building of it as opposed to down in Florida. So again, thank you. Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And I think, some of the aspects of it to dive a little bit deeper into. One is this notion of what makes a game-changing technology, but also what are the barriers to entry to gaining and using that technology. So if we go back a generation or two, the technologies that were, game-changing, revolutionary, that presented these, new powers, new questions, they had pretty high barriers to entry. It was nuclear power. So you needed a Manhattan Project to build it, and only a couple of nations could pull off that. And only a couple of nations, again, whether it's nuclear weapons or moving into nuclear power, could build and use it. So it's limited to state powers. It's the same thing if we think about different tools of war, an aircraft carrier. Not just, only a couple of nations can build them, but let's just imagine a scenario where we parked an aircraft carrier off of Venezuela or off of Cuba and said, here's the keys to it. You don't even have to build it. Do you want to use it? They wouldn't be able to pull that off. Now, whether we're talking about AI or the hardware side with drones, pretty much any actor, powerful state, weak state, non-state actors, whether they're for-profit corporations, they're for-profit cartels, human rights groups, all the way down to individuals, they all can gain that technology. They can use that technology effectively. So I think that's, where we say that math has changed what comes out of it. So with that, to your question, okay, what matters? Is it, I had my notes, your question was, is it speed? Is it precision? Is it adaptability? I think, the quick answer is it depends. The longer answer is, one is because all of the different actors have this, there's going to be some kind of interactivity between those actors. And so, whether we're talking about, does it matter whether I have speed? Does it matter whether I have precision, adaptability? First is, who are the actors? How are they using that AI, that drones? So, let's go to last discussion. It's U.S. military and Southern Command thinking through how to deal with cartels. Guess what? Cartels are also using drones and cheap, whether it's in the air or they've got semi-submersibles. They're engaging in cyber activities. So we'd be thinking about that. There'd be this question of how are they interacting. Then it would depend on the specific realm. So in an area like cyber, and I'm looking at in the front row at our colleague there, former from FIU. I'm not going to put him on the spot, but I think in cyber, the determinant is more likely speed. If we've got AI versus AI, same thing with human hackers. Whereas if instead we're working out how to build an overall strategy, we're probably thinking more adaptability is what's going to win out. And then the final part of it, and you and I were talking about this, is it's really going to be determined by not just the technology, but the human use of it and that part of the human partnership between, so when I'm saying human and AI working together, what do I mean by that? Yeah. And you and I, and so I'm going to throw that back at you. When I say human and AI working together, or human and drone, what do we mean? Well, because
No, we used to
down into a lot of different pathways.
We used to talk a lot about how human, and I'm going to lose that, so I'm going to just put it over there. How human and technology, we always talked about how do we bridge the gap between the human and technology in a way that advances speed, adaptability using the technology. But what we see today in maybe the younger generations is an immediate adaptation to the technology with no bridging required. And when I say that, it's their immediate adaptability to the technology. They don't know a space where I have to learn this. They're humble enough to sit back and go, I don't understand it. I may or may not be able to break it, but I'm going to start using it and I'm going to incorporate it into the things that I do, and I am going to adapt on the fly, adjust on the fly. Oh, and by the way, if I'm able to, because somehow I have this gift, I can also code the LLM, if that's what they're using. I can code it to do something not intended because I'm thinking in a new way. I've adapted it to myself, and now I am using it to help me gain speed. And are we looking at the loss of Moore's law? Back to you.
I'm going to dodge that. Oh, sorry. I'm going to dodge that because I think there's a question before that, which is at the start of when you're deciding to use a technology like AI, but also the hardware side with robotics, the human-machine relationship, you have to make a decision. You have to make a decision in the kind of machine you might buy, how you use it, but the kind of people that you bring in. And there's basically, I would argue, 4 different pathways. There's pathway 1, where the machine is an aid to you, a staff officer, almost like a concierge in a hotel, where it's sifting through lots of different information, it's gathering information about the environment, and it's drawing out insights, conclusions, and it's providing that to you, sometimes in the manner of courses of action, but you, the human, are making the final decision. So it's like a doctor using, getting aid in reading x-rays or diagnosis. It's an intelligence officer or a staffer or a student getting aid from an LLM to help with answer questions for me, maybe even draw up the essay, but I'm the one who ultimately has to submit it. It's Israel in operations in Gaza using AI systems to draw together, everything from drone feeds to seismic data to come up with a list of targets to hit, but the AI is not doing the actual decision. The human decides. Category 2 is the machine is an extension of you. So it's a doctor now doing, actually it's very, remote surgery. It's a drone operator sitting in Tampa flying a drone over a boat in the Caribbean. So it's remote. Or it's Amazon using it for logistics delivery. Third category, related but different, is no, it's my teammate. It's operating alongside me in the factory, in the lab, out in the battlefield. So it's the Air Force has the idea of the robotic wingman, or you go to a factory now, there's humans and machines. And then you have that fourth category, which is the kind of most game-changing, which is, no, it's my agent representing me, whether it's in online social media, it's a bot, to it's drones that are out there that are interacting without me. And that's where you get the whole idea of like swarming. And I just think that's the back to your question, you have to make a decision of which pathway you want to go. And that takes you down very different consequences. But one of the biggest, did you choose the right pathway, right? So if you're using drones and you are, I don't know, the Chinese military, and you choose one pathway, one type, you say, maybe I'm going to go swarming, and I choose, no, I'm going to do remote action. I've got very different legal, ethical questions than you do. But what happens when they come together?
Well, the collision of that is when we start to see where is the human in the loop and where are the ethics behind that human in the loop. And then more importantly, what values do we assign in those specific areas that enable us to choose the right path, and in so choosing being prepared for the collision of those paths so that you can find, maybe thread the needle a little bit, but you can also find how the human, the machine, the teaming, and then the engagement part of that gives you the opportunity to surpass where we are today, and also to start looking at what does it mean to have technology as more than an agent, where now it may be making decisions for you. And if you didn't program values into that, if you didn't program a human into that loop, are we okay with those decisions being made with the parameters that were assigned, and then hoping maybe for the best that somewhere in there someone didn't tweak that in a way that was maybe against what our values were going into that proposition?
Exactly, and there's this idea, you're never fully removing the human. It's just where in that process are they? Is the human, yes, it's advising me, but I'm making the ultimate decision, shoot or not shoot, deliver or not deliver. Now, you're still going to be shaped by, if you're in a situation where the machine is giving you information, the machine is giving you suggested courses of action, you're going to be shaped by that. But that's, we can say, oh no, we're using that agentic model where the human's not making the ultimate decision. Well, the human made the decision to deploy the agentic model, right? Or earlier on, how did we program it? What data was it trained upon? And it's the same thing when you get to the risk. There's always going to be risk of some kind of failure or bad consequence. It's who does that risk fall upon and the accountability for it, right? So does it fall, do we say, whether we're talking about armed drones in the air or driverless cars out on the street, do we say, no, it's the people that are surrounded by them, it's the pedestrian that gets hit. If they weren't in the right crosswalk, that's on them. That's not a made-up example. That's an actual example from Arizona, right? Or if we say, we could have the same discourse on civilian casualties. Or you might move it back and say, no, it's on the person that made the decision at the point of action. It's on the pilot of the Predator that fired the missile or not. It's on the driver in that driverless car. Or we maybe, no, let's go back. The consequence, the risk falls upon the maker, the designer, the manufacturer, right? And I think the problem right now is a discourse that's more about dodging, one, the notion that there is risk. There is, in the excitement about these new technology and the sales of them, too often we only talk about how awesome it is. We could have the same discussion about the stock market right now related to these technologies. They're awesome. They're fueling the economy. They are. But, there may be a little bit of a bubble here, or we get, or the questions of like, how are you going to power them, et cetera. But the same thing. So there's often too much positivity, not accepting that there's going to be risk. And then who is the one that's left holding the actual consequence? And no one wants to volunteer and say, it's me. Instead, they always want to push it to someone else. And so that's where I think we see a lot of policy gaps right now. And again, we could be having a discussion about AI in the streets, AI in war. We could be having, I'm a professor, we could be having a discussion about AI in the classroom and university policies. I don't know what FIUs is. I teach at Arizona State. They basically pushed it down to level to the professors and said, y'all figure it out. And we're left holding the bag, and we don't have a good answer either.
So then that brings to mind, how do you look at the narrative or the story behind AI? Because we're able to really articulate examples across the environment of how we can use technology, where we can use technology, when we can use technology, and I think even the why we use technology. But we really haven't been able to break through two things. The first one being, how do you actually define what technology you're looking at, or our AI definition discussion? Mm-hmm. Because everybody has a different definition of AI. And the other part of it is then, how do you articulate what you're using, why you're using it, and the impact that you want it to have?
So you didn't know this, but you actually just identified a set of workshop topics that we're going to be running together with FIU in the upcoming year. And I can see Brian coming in and being like, oh, this is awesome. She just advertised for us and you didn't even know that. So one of them is going to be working with public and private sector leaders in Florida on what do leaders need to know about AI. And you put your finger on one of the first parts of it, which is this idea of whether you are a Democrat or a Republican, you're public or private sector, you're being asked to make decisions about AI. Not how do I use ChatGPT, but like what are the policies, what are the questions? And for most leaders of a certain age, they didn't grow up in the world of AI, so they don't have a familiarity with basic terms, definitions, basic issues. But part of that is also the very definitions are contested and understanding that, right? So whether it's, you may have your definition of AI, I may have my definition of AI, to use the example of artificial general intelligence. Artificial general intelligence is been defined as everything from an AI that can do multiple different tasks. So it's an LLM that can also do math, which they can't do well. So it can do your taxes and it can help you write a college essay. They can't do both right now. That's one definition. At the other end of the definition, I think it was Sam Altman said it'll be the equivalent of 100 different Nobel Prize winners. These are totally different definitions, right? And then you have and it's not just one that we could go back and forth on. Part of why it matters is there's actual contractual agreements between big companies like Microsoft and OpenAI that turn on and turn off when artificial general intelligence is reached. So if your definition, so the point is we're going to be working with partners in Florida to help educate them on that. The other workshop is on this question of story, and it's a workshop on strategic narrative. And story, doesn't just made up, it's narrative. And narrative is the oldest communication technology of all. We weren't using PowerPoint to communicate when we were in caves. We were using story to share new technologies, lessons learned, our culture, et cetera. And so we're going to be working on, what are the elements of effective story in the policy world. And the most important one that keeps being forgotten is character. Every good story has a character. And that's true whether I'm writing a fictional novel or I'm trying to propose here's how AI could be deployed in, Latin American trade or in the classroom. And most good stories actually have multiple characters, and it's all about those characters' interactions, right? And so that's the same thing, again, if I'm thinking through a good fiction story, whodunit, or I'm thinking through deployment in the classroom or deployment in international trade, I want to be thinking through the multiple different characters and their respective points of view. So that to me, finding the story of AI is really about who are the characters that I'm talking about in it.
It's an interesting perspective that we went from cave-dwelling storytelling to all the way to today, and the fact that the need for us to establish not just a narrative, but a link between the technology and the emotive piece of humans and how they use technology is as important as the tool itself. And I think a little part in there is maybe a lesson for everybody, and I call it the humility of the question, because what we see today is a lot of integration of a lot of technology everywhere. And there isn't a person on site who will tell you that their stuff is not the best thing since sliced bread. But if you aren't humble enough to ask the question where you don't understand, I think you're going to get exactly what you're going to get. And may not help you. It might help you, but it may not help you reach that level of interaction, inclusivity, adaptability, speed that we want to see with technology, but it'll give you something. And in this part of storytelling, I think that you bring up a really key point that no matter how technologically advanced we get, no matter how refined our tools get, it does still always come back to the human, and not just in where we think, but in how we make decisions and in how we respond to the technology that's being presented to us. And I know that wasn't a question. I was just kind of summing up a couple of things for everybody, because you and I are going back and forth on a riff. I want to make sure the audience is with us on that.
But I'm going to turn it into telling a story and then asking a question of you.
Okay.
Which is, so we've run these workshops, and they're for leaders and learning how to drive change through narrative. So, the idea is, don't just drop a PowerPoint on someone. How do you tell a story of change? And one of the speakers at it was Admiral Richardson, the former head of the U.S. Navy, who's now on a number of corporate boards. And when he was giving advice at the last one, he told this group of mid-career policy people, before you come in and brief someone like me, you better know what emotion you want me to feel at the end of the briefing. And you could hear the kind of the wheels turning, people in here does not compute emotion. No, we're taught, cold logic, et cetera. And his point was do you want me to feel FOMO? Oh, this program is awesome. If we don't do it, I'm going to miss out. Or do you want me to feel fear? If we don't do it, bad things are going to happen. Do you want me to feel confidence in you? So that's my story. The question is to you. You've been on the sending and the receiving end of briefings at the highest levels of the U.S. Army, also now on the corporate side. How do you think about when you're trying to tell a story of change, you're being briefed on a story of change? What are your tips for how to, you said explaining complex technologies is a big issue. What are your tips on that?
I always think about my parents. It's always the first thing. Salt of the earth folks. I'm the first one in my family to graduate from university. And so, I always tell people they were the smartest people I knew. Because if they understood a concept, I had been able to distill the most complex issue in a way that not only did they understand it, but they immediately adopted it. And they immediately incorporated into whatever else they were trying to do. And so when I sit in briefings, I always start with, just because there's tons of folks, I always start with, I acknowledge that everyone in this room right now is incredibly intelligent. I know you're smart, and I know you're capable, and I know that you are competent in what you are getting ready to do. I would like to take that stress off the table. Now I want you to explain that to me as if you were explaining it to your mom. And if you can't do that, then you have lost the population that we're serving. Because I'm a geek, I own it. I understand that if you're going to present space technology, if you're going to look at fisheries, if you're going to look at mad scientists, I'm all in. I am all in. And I'm going to do the work on the backside to make sure that I understand what you're bringing to the table. But when I walk out of there, when I'm wearing my uniform, I have to explain that to you, the American public. And I shouldn't do it in a way where you don't understand what I'm saying. I should be able to tie it in a way that not only do you understand it, but that you approve the funds that we have used to buy whatever it is we're going to buy, and that you intrinsically understand how we are going to use it to protect you, to protect the principles of freedom, and to protect democracy. I hope I answered your question. I'm looking at the clock over there surreptitiously, and I know that we have time for questions.
Oh, there was quick ones, yeah.
Okay.
We got time for a few. We got 3.
I'll be very brief. Just on that last point, when it comes to telling the story of AI, because my only worry is you could just do the story. and then you buy into it, and you don't know that there are things AI is able to do that we don't understand how, right? And you have to come at it with that humility and know that there's a risk to the decisions, whatever. You know that, but how do you communicate that, still telling a story that your mom and my mom can understand, but come at it and say also, but there are things we don't understand. You still should use it because of all the reasons. But there are things that we don't fully grasp, and that's just the complexity of it.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and the approach that we've taken is first this idea of establish the baseline, so that here's the terms, here's what I mean by the terms, etc. Then there's the question of, okay, what is it good for? What does it deliver? What's the promise of AI? Then there's the part that I'm hitting earlier comments that we don't talk about enough, often because of interaction on AI issues, is bluntly someone trying to sell us it. And so the other part is, okay, what is AI not good for? Not just now, but what are challenges that it's going to have for the foreseeable future, even as it advances? Data reliability, we can go into all the algorithmic bias. Then there's another issue, which is, what are the policy, legal, ethical questions that are created by AI? And again, no matter how advanced it becomes, you're still going to have those legal, ethical questions, policy questions. And then you have the final part, which is, okay, what does this all look like maybe 5, 10 years from now? And that's where I think you can come at it a little bit through scenario, through narrative, which is, going back to that character. Okay, here's what it will look like applied to this field. Here's how someone, again, might be using it in the lab, or might be using it in trade, or might be using it in warfare. And then let's circle back to those earlier things that we just talked about. In those uses, what are the legal, ethical questions they're going to be wrestling with? How is it helping them? How is it maybe potentially, bringing new issues, new threats in?
And I would say to take a different tone on character, the character behind saying, I don't know what is going to do after this. We're also trying to figure it out. We think it'll do this, and then coming up on the net, that means standing up and saying, whew, we got it wrong. We're taking this thing offline. We're going to redo whatever the coding needed to be redone, and then we're going to bring it back online. I think we also have to have that accountability, that character within us that has us be personally accountable for when we don't get it right, or for when technology does something that we didn't intend it to do. Whoever gets the microphone first.
So, as I think about all the algorithms that you've got to build, the stories you've got to build to use AI, and as we go into the future, my question is, do we, as a liberal democracy, have a more difficult time incorporating AI than other governments might? Because what I'm thinking about is, one administration, the policies are going this way. The American people vote in somebody else and the policies start going this way. So the options that AI gives you, because I'm with you, I don't think there'll ever not be a human in the loop. The options might be a little bit different depending on what is fed in. And we don't have the time or the money to rebuild it every 4 years. So how are we thinking through that?
I think there's a couple of questions. So one is this question that we won't have the answer to for whatever 20, 50 years, which is this a technology that advantages or authoritarian regime centralization more or less, right? So if you go back, to that example I gave of the Manhattan Project, that's big government in action, right? That That's not the idea. That's not Silicon Valley. Oh, by the way, neither is the internet. It's big government saying, I have a vision and I'm going to mobilize all of my different resources, and this is the way, this is what's going to happen. And in that kind of centralization model, that's in effect the China model right now, where the government has identified a set of technology areas and how it's going to reach them, and is basically told not just its government, its military, but through what's known as civil military fusion, its universities, everybody's going to be pushing towards that, and they and they're hoping that that centralization model is the way. U.S. model, we're more, as you put it, we have back and forth between different administrations, but we also tend to have a model where it's lots, we call it our innovation model. It's lots of different approaches happening simultaneously, and in a liberal democracy and in a free market, hopefully the best one works out. So one is just, is this technology like that? There's another issue, which maybe this is a dodge to you, but I think it's not the back and forth. I think in certain areas we're either making decisions or we have already made decisions that have locked us in. And many of them are not happening at the federal, whether it was Trump, Biden, they're happening at the state and local level, right? So think about, data centers and the decisions made related to data centers, which link to power and power grids. Most of that's happening at the state and local level. Many of those decisions have already been made, right, in terms of multi-billion-dollar investments by companies or tax breaks by the state and local. The consequences are already going to play out, whether it's, is this going to lead to an economic boom for different parts of the United States, or will it lead to less jobs, but also things like, are certain areas going to pay more or less for their power in their home and their industry? Are they going to have a water shortage or not? A lot of those decisions are currently being made or have already been made at the state and local level. And that's where it comes back to, I think, what you've been talking about. How do we better equip people, again, whether they're a D or R, to make decisions that are informed decisions?
And I would say that democratizing innovation is what's fueling change. It's what's fueling the speed with which we're watching technology evolve. I think that's our superpower. The centralization can breed blinders that we don't currently have because folks are competing. American firms, American individuals are competing in this technology space, and what we're watching is the best of breed. And so as you see that, it gives you the opportunity to then flex when there are changes that require us to do so, to completely stay out of the political space.
Good evening. So my question is, what role do you think private sector tech companies will play in future conflicts?
Ooh, we're both like rock, paper, scissors, you.
I took you go first this time.
Okay, I'll go first. I'll go first this time. If you're talking about the private sector being tasked with actions in the war space or the battle space, none. That is not an endeavor for private enterprise. That is a solely government endeavor, and the arm that handles that is the Department of Defense/War. I'll use both names, okay? Just to keep the peace. And so I don't see private sector taking prime space in decisions that affect the United States. We do that on behalf of the government, and we do that via orders that are given by our elected leadership, our civilian leadership. We follow those orders to ensure the protection of the United States and its allies and partners. That's what we do. So private enterprise, while it can augment the capabilities and provide those capabilities to the military, they do not have, and I don't ever foresee them having, decision authority for anything that would be considered an action to be taken on behalf of the United States.
So this is awesome. We've been too much in agreement, so we're going to end on disagreement. And it also links back to there's sort of an academic lesson in this. So my senior thesis years and years ago was about how in looking at war, the traditional relationship between the market and government was government bought from private businesses the goods of war. It bought weapons, tanks, airplanes, etc. But that we were starting to see a breaking down of that monopoly, and that starting in the 90s, there was an emergence of companies offering the service side of warfare. And they ranged from back-end logistics like Halliburton KBR. At the high point of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, there were more private contractors deployed than U.S. service members. They were also doing training and equipping, and they're doing the pointy end of the spear, trigger pulling, and that's true whether we were talking about armed contractors on the battlefield to much of the cyber action and the like. Those entities employing them were not just the U.S. military. They ranged from cartels to Russian oligarchs to I'm not even sure, is it the U.S. government? Who's paying the entity in Haiti right now that is linked to, at least according to press reports, the former head of Blackwater? Is this working for U.S. government? Is it working for the Haitian government? If it's the Haitian government, where'd they get the money for it? But the point is, we've got a lot of private sector actors in a lot of different areas offering the service side of warfare. That's also true if we talk about the U.S. military and other militaries' reliance on them to conduct its own actions. So back in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was we couldn't run our own supply chain, to satellite communications, integral for any kind of military operation right now. It used to be government only. It's now running through a private sector enterprise. The positives of that, you get innovation, you get a lot of things government wouldn't offer you. The negatives, ask Ukraine what happened when they wanted to conduct a really cool, exciting raid on a Russian harbor, and the private company said, nope, we're not going to give you access to the satellite network during this. And so Ukraine was not able to operate then. Those are all current. Now we get to what happens next. What do these look like? So what does Haiti look like a year, 5 years from now, when you've outsourced the security system, including reportedly drone strikes on individuals? What does a conflict with China look like, where you're dependent on satellite communications that are owned by a company and an individual that is dependent on China for much of their wealth and much of the production of their most profitable products? Gets really, really complicated. So that's where I think we differ. I think you have the hope, and that's the positive side. I'm throwing in the potential risk side, which is maybe a great ending. But the big takeaway for the students here is that was my senior thesis project. I later did it as my dissertation in graduate school, and it actually became my first book. And I'm still talking about it years later. So the things you work on as an undergrad and a grad might be relevant later on.
That's a great note to end on. I think that was a stinging school. All right, you heard it from two mad scientists, the future of war. What I think is really fascinating about the conversation as you take theory and you put it in practice in the context of security and defense in Latin America is both states and non-state actors are engaging and leveraging these technologies in profound ways. Whether it's illicit cartels that are operating drones on the border for intelligence collection, propaganda, or in the case of Colombia, where drones are sort of running kamikaze missions into police checkpoints. And in many of the countries, the pursuit of advanced technologies like AI are often being led by military institutions and security institutions that are looking to leverage these technologies first and foremost. And so it's an amazing conversation to end on as we think about security and defense in the region going forward. I want to give shouts out, of course, to Team JGI for helping put this together, our partners at RUSI and Athena Lab. Of course, Team DC, and so all of you that are here as guests, you are now welcome here as family, and so feel free to engage the space whenever you want, and of course you for staying in the trenches up until almost 8 o'clock at night. So it's been a great evening. Thank you so much, and this is